Carl Jung explained, 11 spiritual signs. Your spirit is calling for freedom. There's a secret that Carl Jung discovered over a century ago, a secret so unsettling that most people spend their entire lives running from it. It's not a secret about the world, it's a secret about you, and it's this. You are living in a prison of your own making, but the bars are invisible. The walls are made of beliefs you never chose. The guards are the voices in your head that sound like your own but belong to everyone who ever told you who you should be. And the most terrifying part? You've decorated this prison so beautifully that you've mistaken it for freedom. Jung called this prison the persona. It's the mask you wear, the role you play, the acceptable version of yourself you present to the world. And here's what makes it truly insidious. You've worn it so long that you've forgotten it's a mask. You think the persona is you. You defend it. You feed it. You sacrifice your dreams, your truth, your very soul to maintain it. And all the while, something deeper, something truer, is suffocating beneath the weight of who you pretend to be. This video isn't for everyone. If you're comfortable in your cage, if you've made peace with the beautiful lie of your life, then this isn't for you. But if you've felt it, that gnawing restlessness, those strange dreams that wake you in a cold sweat, that voice whispering that there's something more, then what you're about to discover will change everything, because your spirit isn't just calling for freedom, it's screaming for it. And the 11 signs we're about to explore are its emergency broadcast system. Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Think about that for a moment. Not to improve yourself, not to fix yourself, but to accept yourself completely, including the parts you've spent your entire life trying to hide, deny, or destroy. The parts you were told were unacceptable, the desires you buried, the rage you swallowed, the dreams you abandoned because they didn't fit the script society handed you. These 11 signs aren't random symptoms. They're not coincidences. They're the language of your unconscious, that vast, powerful realm beneath your awareness that Jung spent his life mapping. They're breadcrumbs leading you out of the prison, but only if you're brave enough to follow them. Because here's the truth, the path to freedom doesn't lead away from yourself. It leads directly through everything you've been avoiding. I need to be honest with you before we begin. This journey changed my life, but it didn't make my life easier. 3 years ago, I was successful by every conventional measure. Good career, stable relationship, respectable social standing. I was doing everything right, and it was killing me. The panic attacks started small, a tightness in my chest during meetings, an unexplained dread on Sunday nights. Then came the dreams. Night after night, I was drowning in dark water, or trapped in rooms with shrinking walls, or running from something I couldn't see but could feel getting closer. I went to doctors. They found nothing wrong. I went to therapists. They prescribed medication. But nothing worked because the problem wasn't medical. It was metaphysical. My soul was rebelling against the life I was living. My unconscious was staging a coup against the persona I'd built. And it wasn't until I discovered Jung that I understood. I wasn't having a breakdown. I was having a breakthrough. The 11 signs we're about to explore are ancient psychological signals. They've been showing up in human consciousness for thousands of years, manifesting in myths, dreams, spiritual crises, and what we now call mental health struggles. They're the psyche's way of saying the false self is dying, the true self is ready to be born, but you have to let go of everything you think you know about who you are. This isn't a self-help video. This is an initiation. What you're about to learn can't be unlearned. You can't go back to sleep once you've started to wake up. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you ready to meet who you really are? Not who you were told to be, not who you've been pretending to be, but who you actually are beneath all the masks, all the conditioning, all the fear. If the answer is yes, then take a breath, because we're about to descend into the unconscious together. We're about to explore the 11 signs that your spirit, your true self in Jungian terms, is calling for liberation. Some of these signs will feel uncomfortably familiar. Some will seem like they were written specifically about your life, and some will reveal wounds you didn't even know you were carrying. Jung's psychology isn't just theory. It's a map of the soul, and the territory we're about to explore is your own psyche. Vast, mysterious, and more powerful than you can imagine. The persona you've built is just the surface. Beneath it lies the shadow, everything you've denied about yourself. Beneath that lies the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspects of your psyche that hold the key to wholeness. And at the very center, guiding the entire journey, is the self with a capital S, the organizing principle of your entire being, the you that existed before you were taught who to be. These 11 signs are how the self communicates when the ego, your conscious mind, refuses to listen. They're not punishment. They're not evidence that something is wrong with you. They're invitations. Painful, disruptive, impossible to ignore invitations to the most important journey you will ever take, the journey to become who you were always meant to be. So, let's begin. The first sign is the one that probably brought you to this video in the first place, the one you've been feeling for weeks, months, maybe even years, the restlessness that won't be silenced. You've achieved everything you were supposed to achieve. You checked all the boxes. You followed the plan. You became the person everyone expected you to become. And yet, there's this feeling, this constant gnawing sensation that something is deeply, profoundly wrong. It's not sadness exactly. It's not anxiety in the clinical sense. It's something stranger, something harder to name. It's a restlessness that lives in your bones, an itch you can't scratch. A hunger that food doesn't satisfy. You try to ignore it. You throw yourself into work, into relationships, into hobbies and distractions. You tell yourself you're just stressed, just tired, just going through a phase. You buy things, change your hair, plan vacations, and for a few hours or days, the restlessness quiets. But it always comes back, always, like a tide you can't control. It returns. More insistent than before, and deep down, you know, this isn't going away. Something is trying to get your attention, and it won't stop until you listen. This, according to Jung, is the first sign that your spirit is calling for freedom. But to understand what's really happening, we need to understand a fundamental concept in Jungian psychology, the difference between the ego and the self. The ego is your conscious mind, your sense of I, the part of you that makes decisions and navigates daily life. It's important, necessary even, but it's not the whole story. The self, capital S, is the totality of your being, the organizing principle of your entire psyche, conscious and unconscious, combined. It's who you are in your deepest essence, beyond all roles and identities. The problem begins when the ego, in its attempt to fit into society, creates a persona, a mask, an acceptable version of yourself that becomes increasingly distant from the self. You build this persona in childhood and adolescence, learning what gets approval, what gets love, what keeps you safe. You learn to hide the parts of yourself that make others uncomfortable. You learn to want what you're supposed to want. You learn to be who you're supposed to be, and slowly, gradually, without even realizing it, you forget who you actually are. For years, maybe decades, this works. The persona functions. You get by. You might even succeed spectacularly in the external world. But the self doesn't forget. It knows what you've abandoned. It remembers every dream you killed, every truth you swallowed, every time you chose safety over authenticity, and eventually it starts to rebel. Jung called this the unlived life, all the potential, all the possibility, all the authenticity that you buried in service of the persona. And the unlived life doesn't just disappear. It festers, it pressures, it creates symptoms. The restlessness you feel is the self trying to communicate through the only language it has: discomfort. It's saying, this life you're living, it's not yours. This persona you're maintaining, it's a prison, and if you don't start listening, I'm going to make this unbearable. The restlessness is sacred. It's not a problem to be solved or a symptom to be medicated. It's a signal to be decoded. Let me tell you about David. David came to see me 2 years ago, though he didn't want to. His wife insisted after his third panic attack in as many months. On paper, David's life was a masterpiece of success. He was a partner at a prestigious law firm, earning more money than he'd ever imagined possible growing up in a working-class family. He had a beautiful home, 2 kids in private school, and a social circle full of influential people. He was, by every conventional measure, winning at life. But David was dying inside. The panic attacks were just the beginning. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't concentrate. He'd find himself sitting in his car in the firm's parking garage, unable to make himself go inside. He'd look at his calendar full of depositions and client meetings and feel something close to nausea. "I don't understand," he told me in that first session. "This is everything I worked for. This is the dream. So why does it feel like a nightmare?" What David didn't know, what he'd spent 20 years avoiding, was that becoming a lawyer had never been his dream. It had been his father's dream, his immigrant father who'd worked construction his whole life and wanted more for his son, who'd beamed with pride when David got into law school, who'd told everyone in their community that his son was going to be somebody. And David, loving his father, wanting to honor the sacrifice, had buried his own dreams so deep that he'd convinced himself they were never real in the first place. But the unconscious never forgets. In our sessions, I asked David to tell me about his childhood. What did he love before he learned what he was supposed to love? And slowly, hesitantly, the truth emerged. David had wanted to be an artist. Not a lawyer, an artist. He'd spent his teenage years covering notebooks with drawings, losing hours in the flow of creation. His art teachers had encouraged him. One had even suggested he apply to art school. But his father's face when he mentioned it, the disappointment, the fear, the unspoken message that art was a luxury their family couldn't afford, had been enough. David put away his sketchbooks, applied to pre-law programs, and never looked back. Except the part of him that wanted to create never died. It went into what Jung called the shadow, the repository of everything we deny about ourselves. And for 20 years, that denied artist self lived in David's unconscious, sending increasingly desperate signals. The panic attacks weren't random. They were the buried part of David trying to break free. The restlessness wasn't a mystery. It was the voice of his unlived life, screaming to be heard. This is the mechanism beneath the restlessness. It's not that you're ungrateful or broken or weak. It's that you're living someone else's life. You're piloting a persona that was designed by parents, by culture, by the collective expectations of everyone except the one person whose opinion actually matters, your true self. And the self, when denied long enough, will create symptoms to get your attention. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you were told to be, not who you think you should be, but who you truly are." And the restlessness is the first sign that the process of becoming, what Jung called individuation, is beginning whether you're ready or not. The psyche has decided it's time. The question is whether you'll participate consciously or be dragged through it unconsciously. Now, I need to distinguish between 2 types of restlessness, because this is where people often get confused. There's neurotic anxiety, the kind that comes from unresolved trauma, from legitimate mental health conditions, from circumstances that genuinely need to change. This kind of anxiety needs professional support, possibly medication, definitely therapeutic intervention. I'm not dismissing that. In fact, rule that out first. Work with professionals. Do the clinical work. But then there's sacred restlessness. This is different. This is the feeling that persists even after you've addressed the obvious problems. Even after you've gone to therapy, taken the medication, fixed the relationship problems, achieved the goals. This is the restlessness that actually gets worse when your life gets better, because it's not about your circumstances. It's about your soul's fidelity to itself. It's the psyche saying, I don't care how successful you are, how comfortable you are, how much approval you have. You're not living your truth, and I won't let you forget it. The sacred restlessness often intensifies around midlife. Jung's famous midlife crisis, which isn't a crisis of aging, but a crisis of authenticity. By midlife, the persona has been in place for decades. You've invested everything in it. Your identity, your relationships, your entire life structure depends on maintaining it. And that's precisely when the self often chooses to stage its rebellion, because if it doesn't happen now, you might live your entire life as a stranger to yourself. But here's what's both terrifying and liberating. The restlessness is actually a sign of health. It means your psyche is still alive, still fighting, still refusing to accept the death of your authentic self. People who never feel this restlessness, who are perfectly content in their personas, who never question the script they're living, they're the ones Jung worried about. They're the ones who've achieved a kind of psychological death while still breathing. The restlessness means you're still alive in the deepest sense. It means the self hasn't given up on you. So what do you do with this restlessness? First, stop trying to fix it. Stop trying to make it go away through achievement, through acquisition, through numbing. The restlessness is not the problem. It's the solution trying to emerge. It's the voice of your unlived life, demanding to be lived. Second, start listening to it. Really listening. What is it pointing you toward? What did you abandon to become acceptable? What dreams did you bury? What parts of yourself have you disowned? This requires brutal honesty. It requires you to look at your life and ask, whose dreams am I living? Whose values have I adopted? Whose approval am I seeking? And it requires you to face something even harder. The gap between who you are and who you've been pretending to be might be vast. Closing that gap might require letting go of things you've built your entire identity around. It might require disappointing people. It might require a kind of death before rebirth is possible. David's story doesn't have a simple Hollywood ending. He didn't quit law and become a famous artist. That's not how this works. But what he did do was begin the process of integration. He started drawing again, not as a career, but as a sacred practice. He rearranged his schedule to make space for creativity, even though it meant taking on fewer cases, making less money, disappointing partners who wanted more from him. He had conversations with his wife and kids about who he really was, not just the role he played. And slowly, over months and then years, the panic attacks stopped. The restlessness didn't disappear entirely. Sacred restlessness never does. But it transformed from a scream into a compass. Because here's the secret. The goal isn't to eliminate the restlessness. The goal is to let it guide you. It's showing you where you've betrayed yourself, where you've abandoned your truth, where you need to reclaim your life. Jung believed that the psyche is self-regulating, that it will always push toward wholeness if we let it. The restlessness is that push. It's your internal GPS recalculating because you've gone so far off course. Before we move to the second sign, I want you to pause and ask yourself a question. Don't just think about it, feel into it. What dreams did you bury to become acceptable? What part of yourself did you kill to survive? What does your restlessness know that you're afraid to admit? The answer to that question is the beginning of your liberation. The restlessness is already showing you the way. The question is whether you're brave enough to follow. Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The restlessness is the pain. The consciousness is what you're moving toward. And the journey we're on together through these 11 signs is the map. So take a breath. The restlessness brought you here. Now let's see where it wants to take you next. You wake up gasping. Your heart is racing. The dream is already fading, but the feeling lingers. The suffocating terror of being trapped, the panic of drowning in dark water, the primal fear of something chasing you through endless corridors. You tell yourself it's just a dream, just neurons firing randomly during REM sleep. You check your phone, scroll through social media, anything to shake off the residue of that other world. But night after night, the dreams return. Same themes, different variations. And you can't help wondering, what is my unconscious trying to tell me? For Jung, dreams were never random. They were the psyche's emergency broadcast system, the voice of the unconscious, speaking in the only language it knows: symbols, images, and emotional landscapes. When the conscious mind refuses to listen, when the ego is too defended to hear the truth, the unconscious turns up the volume. It sends nightmares. And the most common nightmares during a spiritual awakening, during what Jung called the individuation process, cluster around 3 archetypal themes: imprisonment, drowning, and being chased. These aren't arbitrary. They're the shadow's way of showing you exactly what's happening in your psyche. Dreams of imprisonment reveal that your persona has become a prison. Dreams of drowning show you're being overwhelmed by unconscious content you've repressed. Dreams of being chased expose the shadow elements, the denied parts of yourself that are demanding integration. Let's decode each of these, because understanding your dreams is understanding the roadmap your psyche is desperately trying to give you. Dreams of imprisonment, the persona as prison. You're locked in a room, or trapped in a building, or behind bars, or buried alive. The variations are endless, but the core symbol is the same. You cannot escape. You pound on walls, scream for help, search frantically for a key, a door, any way out. And often, the most disturbing part isn't the imprisonment itself. It's the growing realization in the dream that you might be trapped forever. This is your unconscious showing you what your conscious mind refuses to see. The persona you've constructed has become a cage. Remember, the persona is the mask you wear, the social role you play, the acceptable version of yourself. It's necessary for functioning in society. Jung never suggested we abandon it entirely, but when the persona becomes the only version of yourself you're allowed to be, when you've identified so completely with the mask that you've forgotten there's a face underneath, that's when it becomes a prison. The dream of imprisonment is often the first major dream signal during a spiritual awakening because it's the most direct. The unconscious isn't being subtle anymore. It's saying, you're locked in a life that isn't yours. You're trapped in an identity that's killing you. And if you don't start looking for the key, you're going to suffocate. The key, in Jungian terms, is always the same: consciousness, awareness, the willingness to look at what you've been avoiding. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah is a therapist. Yes, therapists need therapy too, often especially, and she came to me with a recurring dream that had been terrorizing her for months. In the dream, she was trapped in her childhood home, specifically in her bedroom, but it wasn't her bedroom as it actually was. It was smaller, darker, the walls were closing in. She would try to leave, but the door was locked from the outside. She'd scream, but no one would come. And the worst part was the knowledge, growing throughout the dream, that she'd been there for years, that she'd somehow forgotten she was imprisoned, until this moment of horrifying clarity. When we explored the dream's symbolism, the truth emerged. Sarah had become a therapist because her mother had been a therapist, and her grandmother before that. It was the family profession, the family identity, and Sarah was good at it. She helped people, she was successful, but she'd never asked herself if it was what she actually wanted to do. She'd stepped into the role so seamlessly, had embodied the persona of therapist so completely that she'd never questioned whether it was her calling or her conditioning. The childhood bedroom in the dream was key. Childhood is when we form the persona, when we learn what's acceptable and what must be hidden. By trapping Sarah there in the dream, her unconscious was saying, "You're still living according to decisions you made as a child. You're still performing for parental approval. You locked yourself in this identity, and you've been there so long you forgot it was a choice." The locked door, locked from the outside, showed that Sarah felt her imprisonment was imposed by others, by family expectations, by professional identity, by the weight of years of investment in this path. But here's the twist Jung would emphasize. The door is always locked from both sides. Yes, society, family, culture, they create expectations, they build cages, but we're the ones who stay in them. We're the ones who stop testing the door, who accept the imprisonment as inevitable. The dream wasn't just showing Sarah that she was trapped. It was showing her that she had agency in her imprisonment, which meant she could also have agency in her liberation. Dreams of drowning, overwhelmed by the unconscious. Water in dreams almost always represents the unconscious, that vast realm of denied feelings, repressed memories, shadow content, and archetypal energies that exist beneath the surface of awareness. And when you dream of drowning, your psyche is showing you that you're being overwhelmed by unconscious material that you've kept submerged for too long. Think about the mechanism of repression. Every time you have a feeling you're not allowed to have, every time you have a desire you're supposed to suppress, every time you have a reaction that doesn't fit your persona, you push it down, you submerge it in the unconscious. And for a while, this works. The unconscious is vast, it can hold a lot. But eventually, the pressure builds. The repressed content becomes active, dynamic, demanding to surface. And that's when the drowning dreams begin. In these dreams, you're often in dark water, ocean, lake, sometimes just vague dark liquid. You're struggling to stay afloat, but you're exhausted, or you're pulled under by something unseen, or the water is rising and there's nowhere to go. The terror is visceral because drowning is one of our most primal fears, the loss of breath, the loss of control, the inevitability of being consumed by something larger than ourselves. What makes drowning dreams particularly significant during spiritual awakening is that they often appear right before a breakthrough. The unconscious material that's been repressed is ready to surface. The shadow content wants to be integrated, but the ego is terrified of being overwhelmed, of losing control, of letting in feelings and truths that might shatter its carefully constructed world. So it experiences the potential integration as drowning, as death. And in a sense, it is a death. The death of the old self, the death of the persona that could only exist by keeping vast parts of the psyche underwater. But what the ego doesn't understand yet is that this death is necessary for rebirth. You can't become whole while keeping half of yourself submerged. Integration requires letting the unconscious content surface, even if it feels like drowning at first. Sarah's drowning dreams came later in her process, after she'd started to acknowledge her imprisonment. Once she admitted to herself that she might not want to be a therapist forever, once she started exploring other interests and possibilities, the unconscious material she'd been repressing began to surface, and it terrified her. She dreamed of being in an ocean, waves crashing over her, pulling her under. She'd wake up gasping, heart pounding, feeling like she couldn't breathe. What was drowning her? All the emotions she'd suppressed in service of her therapist persona. anger at her mother for the subtle pressure to follow the family path, resentment at all the years she'd spent living someone else's dream, fear of what would happen if she chose differently, grief for the time lost, and beneath all of that, the most terrifying feeling of all, the excitement, the aliveness, the possibility of living authentically. Because if she admitted to feeling that, she'd have to act on it. She'd have to make changes that felt impossibly hard. The drowning dreams were showing Sarah that she couldn't keep all of this underwater anymore. It was going to surface whether she was ready or not. Her only choice was whether to let it surface consciously, through careful therapeutic work and integration, or whether to wait until it erupted unconsciously, overwhelming her in a way she couldn't control. Dreams of being chased. The shadow demands integration, the most common nightmare of all. Something is chasing you, a monster, a figure, an animal, sometimes just a presence you can't see but can feel getting closer. You run, but you can never run fast enough. You hide, but it always finds you. You try to fight, but you're powerless. And always, always, there's the terror that if it catches you, something terrible will happen. Jung's interpretation of these dreams is revolutionary and for many people, life-changing. The thing chasing you isn't an external threat, it's you. It's the shadow, the denied, rejected, disowned parts of yourself that you've spent your life running from. And the reason it keeps chasing you, the reason you can never escape, is because you can't outrun yourself. The shadow will pursue you until you turn around and face it. This is hard to accept because the shadow often appears terrifying in dreams. It might be monstrous, violent, dark, threatening. How could that be me? But here's what Jung understood. The shadow becomes monstrous precisely because we've rejected it. Anything we deny in ourselves doesn't disappear. It goes underground into the unconscious, where it gathers energy and becomes distorted. The longer we run from it, the more frightening it becomes. But its fundamental purpose isn't to harm us. Its purpose is to be integrated, to be brought back into consciousness, to be recognized as a lost part of ourselves. What's in the shadow? Everything you were told was unacceptable. Your rage, your sexuality, your selfishness, your power, your softness, your neediness, whatever didn't fit the persona. For women in patriarchal cultures, the shadow often contains their aggression, their ambition, their sexual agency. For men, it often contains their vulnerability, their emotions, their need for connection. But it's different for everyone, shaped by your unique history, your family dynamics, your culture's particular neuroses. The dreams of being chased intensify during spiritual awakening because the individuation process requires shadow integration. You can't become whole while disowning parts of yourself. The self, that organizing principle of wholeness, insists on including everything, light and shadow, acceptable and unacceptable. So the shadow stages an uprising. It chases you in dreams, demanding recognition. Sarah's chase dreams came in the final phase of her awakening process. She dreamed of being pursued through dark streets by a woman. Always a woman, always wearing business clothes, always relentless. Sarah would run until her lungs burned, hide in buildings, try to lock doors. But the woman always found her, and Sarah would wake up just as the woman was reaching for her, her hand outstretched, her face still hidden in shadow. When we worked with this dream using Jung's technique of active imagination, which we'll explore more deeply in a moment, the truth revealed itself. The woman wasn't a threat. She was the part of Sarah that Sarah had disowned. The ambitious part, the competitive part, the part that wanted success and recognition, not just for helping others, but for her own sake. Sarah had built her identity around being selfless, caring, endlessly giving. Any desire for personal success, any competitive drive, any self-interest was banished to the shadow because it didn't fit the persona of the perfect, self-sacrificing therapist. But that disowned ambition didn't disappear. It became the woman in the dream, chasing Sarah, trying to get her attention, trying to be acknowledged. And what Sarah discovered when she finally stopped running, in the dream work and then in her life, was that this shadow part wasn't evil. It was powerful. It was the part of her that could help her break free from the family pattern, make her own choices, build a life that was actually hers. The shadow was chasing her, not to destroy her, but to complete her. The 4-step shadow dream interpretation method. So how do you work with these dreams? How do you decode what your unconscious is trying to tell you? Jung developed a sophisticated approach called active imagination, but here's a practical framework that incorporates his principles. Step 1. Record the dream immediately. Write it down as soon as you wake up. Include every detail you can remember, setting, characters, emotions, colors, anything that stands out. Don't analyze yet, just capture. Dreams fade fast. You want the raw material. Step 2. Identify the core symbol. What's the most powerful image or feeling in the dream? In imprisonment dreams, it's often the locked room or the walls. In drowning dreams, it's the water or the sensation of going under. In chase dreams, it's the pursuer. This core symbol is where the unconscious concentrated its message. Step 3. Amplification through association. This is Jung's method. Take the core symbol and free associate. What does imprisonment mean to you personally? What does water represent? What qualities does the chaser have? Don't reach for universal meanings. Start with your subjective experience. The symbol means what it means to you, not what a dream dictionary says. Step 4. Active imagination dialogue. This is advanced but powerful. In a meditative state, imagine yourself back in the dream, but this time, instead of running or panicking, engage with the symbol. If you're imprisoned, examine the walls. What are they made of? Try the door. Is it really locked or just stuck? If you're drowning, let yourself sink. What's at the bottom? If you're being chased, stop running and turn around. Face the pursuer. Ask, who are you? What do you want from me? This sounds strange, I know, but what you're doing is opening a dialogue between your conscious ego and your unconscious content. And the responses that come, whether words, images, feelings, or sudden realizations, are pure gold. They're your psyche talking to itself, bringing shadow material into consciousness. Sarah used this method with her chase dream. In meditation, she imagined herself back in the dark streets. This time, when she heard footsteps behind her, she stopped running. She turned around. She waited. The woman emerged from the shadows, still in business clothes, but as Sarah stayed present, the woman's face became clear. And with a shock, Sarah realized it was her. An older version of her, yes, but unmistakably her, confident, powerful, unapologetic. What do you want from me? Sarah asked in the meditation. I want you to stop pretending, the woman answered. Stop pretending you don't want things for yourself. Stop pretending ambition is ugly. Stop pretending your mother's path is your path. I'm not chasing you to hurt you. I'm chasing you because you left me behind, and I'm tired of being denied. That moment changed everything for Sarah. She understood that her shadow wasn't something to fear or suppress. It was something to integrate. And integration doesn't mean becoming selfish or abandoning compassion. It means becoming whole. It means acknowledging all of yourself, the giving parts and the ambitious parts, the selfless parts and the self-interested parts. It means becoming complex, nuanced, real. The warning, don't literalize dreams. Before we move on, I need to issue an important warning. Dreams are symbolic, not literal. If you dream of being chased by your boss, it doesn't necessarily mean your boss is a threat. More likely, your boss represents something, authority perhaps, or the oppressive weight of external expectations. If you dream of drowning in your childhood home, you're not receiving a premonition. You're being shown that childhood patterns and unconscious material from that time are overwhelming you now. The ego wants to literalize dreams because literal interpretations are safer. It's just stress about work. I watched a scary movie. I ate too late. These explanations keep the dream's message at bay. But the unconscious speaks in poetry, not prose. It speaks in symbols, not facts. To understand your dreams, you have to learn their language. And that language is the language of the psyche itself. Ancient, archetypal, endlessly creative. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Your dreams are showing you what's unconscious. They're showing you the prison you don't see, the material you've submerged, the parts of yourself you're running from. And they're showing you all of this not to torment you, but to free you. If you're having these dreams, imprisonment, drowning, being chased, don't dismiss them. Don't medicate them away without first listening to what they're trying to tell you. Work with them, write them down. Use the framework I just gave you. Open a dialogue with your unconscious, because these dreams are occurring for a reason. Your spirit is calling for freedom, and it's using the language of dreams because that's the language you might actually hear. Sarah's dreams didn't stop immediately after her realizations. That's not how it works. But they changed. The woman stopped chasing her and started walking beside her. The water in her drowning dreams became calmer, clearer. The prison doors began to open. Because dreams don't just reflect your current psychological state, they anticipate your potential transformation. They show you not just where you are, but where you're going if you do the work. So pay attention to your dreams, especially the nightmares, especially the recurring ones. They're not random firing of neurons. They're letters from your unconscious, written in the oldest language we have. And right now, if you're experiencing a spiritual awakening, if your spirit is calling for freedom, your unconscious is writing you urgent letters. The only question is whether you're willing to read them. Your body is screaming, but the doctors can't find anything wrong. You've been to specialists. You've had the tests, blood work, scans, imaging, all of it. Everything comes back normal. You're perfectly healthy, they tell you, and you want to scream because you don't feel healthy. You feel exhausted beyond reason, or there's chronic pain that migrates through your body, your back, your neck, your joints, or migraines that arrive without warning and steal days from your life, or digestive issues that no diet seems to fix, or a heaviness in your chest that makes breathing feel like work. And the most maddening part, the symptoms are real. This isn't in your head in the dismissive way people mean that phrase. The pain is real. The exhaustion is real. The body is genuinely suffering. But Western medicine, with its focus on physical causes and mechanical solutions, can't find the source. So you're told it's stress, or you're given antidepressants, or worse, you're made to feel like you're imagining it, like you're weak, like you should just push through. But Jung understood something that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. The psyche and soma, mind and body, aren't separate. They're one unified system. And when the psyche is sick, when psychological content is repressed and denied, it doesn't just stay in your thoughts. It moves into your body. It becomes physical. This is what Jung meant by psychosomatic illness. Not imaginary illness, but illness that originates in the psyche and manifests in the soma. This is the third sign that your spirit is calling for freedom. Your body has become the battlefield because your mind refused to be the courtroom. When you won't consciously process what needs to be processed, when you won't feel what needs to be felt, when you won't acknowledge what needs to be acknowledged, the unconscious finds another way. It speaks through your flesh, your bones, your nervous system, and it will keep speaking louder and louder until you finally listen. The body keeps the score of your unlived life. There's a revolutionary book by psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score, and while it focuses on trauma, the principle applies to all repressed psychological content. Your body remembers everything your conscious mind has forgotten or denied. Every suppressed emotion, every swallowed truth, every time you said, "I'm fine," when you weren't fine, your body recorded it. And that record doesn't just sit there, passively. It has effects, physiological, tangible, measurable effects. When you're constantly in a state of internal contradiction, when your outer life doesn't match your inner truth, your nervous system stays in a state of chronic activation. Your body thinks it's under threat because psychologically it is. The threat isn't external. It's the violence you're doing to yourself by living inauthentically. And your body responds the way bodies respond to threat. With cortisol, with inflammation, with pain, with fatigue, with all the symptoms of being under siege. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his patients, people who came to him with mysterious physical ailments that medicine couldn't cure. And when they did the psychological work, when they confronted their shadow, when they acknowledged their repressed desires, when they stopped living lives that betrayed their essential nature, the physical symptoms often improved or disappeared entirely. Not always, not magically, but often enough that Jung understood. The body and psyche are in constant communication, and when that communication is blocked consciously, it finds unconscious roots. Let me tell you about Emma. Emma came to me not for therapy, but because her doctor, after 2 years of failed treatments, suggested she explore psychological factors. Emma was a 38-year-old corporate executive with chronic migraines that had intensified over the past 3 years to the point where she was missing work, canceling plans, living in fear of the next attack. She'd tried every medication, every dietary change, every alternative treatment. Nothing worked. The migraines came like clockwork, 2 or 3 times a week, stealing her life. "I just want them to stop," she told me in our first session. "I don't care about anything else. I just want my life back." But here's what I've learned working with psychosomatic symptoms. They don't exist to torture you. They exist to communicate something that's being ignored. So instead of focusing on making the migraines stop, we focused on what they might be trying to say. I asked Emma to track them, not just when they occurred, but what was happening in her life when they occurred. What was she thinking about? What had she just done or was about to do? What was she avoiding? The pattern emerged within weeks. The migraines came most frequently on Sunday evenings and Wednesday afternoons. Sunday evening, right before the work week started. Wednesday afternoon, right before a weekly leadership meeting she was expected to run. These weren't random. These were her body's way of saying, "I can't do this anymore." But what couldn't she do? She loved her career, she insisted. She'd worked hard for her position. She was good at it. This was everything she'd wanted. Except, and this is where the real work began, it wasn't. Not anymore. Maybe it had been once, in her 20s, when she was hungry and ambitious and climbing the ladder. But somewhere along the way, it had stopped feeding her soul and started consuming it. The corporate culture was toxic, but she'd normalized it. The leadership meetings were performative power struggles that made her feel sick, but she'd learned to play the game. She was succeeding at something that was killing her, but she'd invested too much to admit it. And because she wouldn't admit it consciously, because she couldn't let herself know what she knew, her body did it for her. The migraines were her psyche's emergency brake. They were the only thing forcing her to stop, to rest, to not be the person she was pretending to be, even if just for a day. They were painful, yes, but they were also protection. Protection from a life that had become, psychologically, untenable. The 5 most common psychosomatic freedom signals. Jung identified patterns in how the psyche communicates through the body. While everyone's experience is unique, there are certain symptoms that appear repeatedly when someone's spirit is calling for freedom. 1. Chronic fatigue. That sleep doesn't cure. This is exhaustion at the soul level. You can sleep for 10 hours and wake up tired because the fatigue isn't physical. It's existential. It's the exhaustion of maintaining a persona that requires constant energy. It's the exhaustion of suppressing your truth every single day. It's your body saying, I don't have the energy to keep living this lie. 2. Chronic pain that moves or doesn't have a clear structural cause. Back pain, neck pain, shoulder tension, jaw clenching. These often represent the literal burden you're carrying. The weight of expectations, the tension of holding yourself in a position that isn't natural to you. When doctors can't find a structural reason, consider, what am I carrying that I need to put down? What position am I forcing myself into psychologically? 3. Digestive issues without medical explanation. The gut is incredibly sensitive to psychological states. When you can't digest what's happening in your life, when you can't stomach your circumstances, when something makes you sick on a deep level, your digestive system often reflects that. The inability to process psychologically becomes an inability to process physically. 4. Migraines or tension headaches. Often related to internal conflict, to thinking in ways that contradict your deeper knowing, to the pressure of maintaining cognitive dissonance. Your head hurts because holding two contradictory truths, I'm happy and I'm dying inside, creates genuine neurological stress. 5. Immune system dysfunction. Frequent illness, autoimmune conditions, allergies. These can emerge when the psyche's defense system is overwhelmed. When you're constantly defending against your own truth, when you're at war with yourself internally, the immune system sometimes mirrors that by attacking healthy tissue or failing to defend against external threats. The medical ethics boundary. Rule out physical causes. First, I need to be absolutely clear about something. I'm not suggesting that all physical illness is psychological. That would be reductive, irresponsible, and wrong. There are genuine physical diseases. There are structural problems that require medical intervention. There are neurological conditions, infections, tumors, injuries, real physical causes that need real medical treatment. Always, always rule out physical causes first. Work with competent medical professionals. Get the tests. Take the conditions seriously. Don't spiritually bypass legitimate medical needs by assuming everything is psychological. That's not Jungian psychology. That's magical thinking, and it can be dangerous. But, and this is important, once physical causes have been ruled out, once you've been told there's nothing wrong but you're still suffering, then it's time to explore the psychological dimension. This isn't giving up on finding a cure. This is expanding your understanding of what might be causing the symptoms. And often, addressing the psychological roots doesn't just improve symptoms, it transforms your entire relationship with your body and your life. Emma's neurologist, to his credit, supported this exploration. He didn't dismiss her pain as just psychological. He understood that psychological origins don't make pain less real. They just point to a different treatment approach. And as Emma began to do the psychological work, as she started to acknowledge how deeply unhappy she was in her career, as she explored what her soul was actually calling her toward, as she began making changes in her external life to align with her internal truth, the migraines began to change. They didn't disappear overnight. Healing isn't linear, but they became less frequent, less severe. And more importantly, Emma understood them differently. Instead of seeing them as a curse or a weakness, she began to see them as messengers. When a migraine would start to come on, instead of just medicating it, she'd ask, "What am I avoiding right now?" What truth am I not facing? What decision am I postponing? And often she'd find the answer. She was avoiding a difficult conversation. She was forcing herself to attend an event that felt soul-crushing. She was ignoring her body's signals about needing rest or solitude or creative time. The migraine was her body's way of enforcing boundaries that she wouldn't enforce consciously. And as she got better at enforcing them herself, as she learned to listen to the quieter signals before they had to become screaming pain, the migraines gradually lost their hold. What is your body trying to tell you? This requires a different relationship with your symptoms. Instead of seeing them as the enemy to be defeated, what if you saw them as messengers trying to get your attention? What if your body's rebellion is actually its wisdom? Try this. The next time you experience one of these mysterious symptoms, instead of immediately trying to make it go away, sit with it. Not in a masochistic way, but in a curious way. Put your attention on the sensation. Ask it, what are you trying to tell me? What do you need me to know? What am I not acknowledging? You might not get a clear answer immediately. The psychosomatic language isn't always direct. But patterns will emerge if you pay attention. You'll notice the symptoms worsen in certain contexts, around certain people, when you're doing certain things or avoiding certain things. Those patterns are data. They're your unconscious communicating through the only channel it has left. Jung used a technique called active imagination with physical symptoms, similar to what we discussed with dreams. In a meditative state, you can imagine the symptom as having a personality, a voice. You can dialogue with it. It sounds strange, but it works because you're essentially creating a bridge between your conscious mind and the unconscious content that's causing the symptom. Emma did this with her migraines. In one particularly powerful session, I guided her to imagine her migraine pain as a person. What would it look like? How would it speak? She imagined it as a woman herself, but younger, maybe 16 or 17, a version of herself she'd forgotten. I asked Emma to speak to this younger self, to ask what she needed, and the younger Emma said simply, I wanted to be an artist. You promised me we'd make art, and you haven't picked up a brush in 15 years. Emma started crying in that session, deep sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient, because it was true. She'd been an art student in college, passionate and talented, but her parents had worried about her ability to make a living, and she'd been practical. She'd switched to business. She'd told herself art could be a hobby, except it never was. There was always something more important, more urgent, more adult to do, and that part of her that needed to create, that younger Emma who'd promised herself a life of color and beauty and expression, had been silenced, buried, denied. And now, 20 years later, that denied part was screaming, through migraines, through pain so intense it forced Emma to stop, to close her eyes, to sit in darkness, which was the only way it could force her to turn inward, to remember, to feel the grief of the unlived life. The body as battleground and bridge. There's a paradox in psychosomatic symptoms. On one hand, they represent the battleground where the conflict between your authentic self and your persona plays out. They're the casualties of that internal war. But on the other hand, they're also the bridge to healing. They're forcing you to pay attention in a way that purely psychological symptoms might not. You can rationalize away restlessness. You can dismiss dreams, but you can't ignore chronic pain. You can't think your way around migraines. The body demands attention in a way the mind can evade. So in a strange way, psychosomatic symptoms are a gift. A painful, inconvenient, life-disrupting gift, yes, but a gift nonetheless. They're the self-correcting mechanism of the psyche, refusing to let you abandon yourself completely. They're your body's loyalty to your soul, even when your conscious mind has betrayed it. Jung wrote, "The body is the visible expression of the psyche." What is your body expressing right now? What is it making visible that you've tried to keep hidden? What is it forcing you to acknowledge? I'm not saying this awareness makes the symptoms easier to bear. I'm not suggesting that understanding the psychological roots is a magic cure. Sometimes the damage is done, and healing requires both psychological work and medical intervention. Sometimes the patterns are so deep that unwinding them takes years. Sometimes the body has learned the symptoms so thoroughly that it persists even after the psychological cause is addressed. But what I am saying is this: your body is not your enemy, even when it's in pain, even when it's failing you, even when it's sabotaging your plans. It's not trying to hurt you. It's trying to save you. It's speaking the truth that you're too afraid to speak. It's enforcing boundaries you're too conditioned to enforce. It's staging a rebellion against the life that's killing you from the inside out. Emma eventually left her corporate job. It took 2 years of preparation, financial planning, soul-searching, difficult conversations with her partner about what success really meant. She didn't quit impulsively or spiritually bypass the practical realities, but she did make a choice to stop sacrificing her soul for a version of success that was making her sick. She's teaching art now to teenagers mostly, kids like her younger self. She makes less money. Her parents worry. Some of her friends didn't understand. But the migraines, they're rare now, not gone entirely. She's not a fairy tale, but rare enough that she has her life back, and more importantly, she has herself back, the version of herself she thought she had to kill to be acceptable. Before we move to the 4th sign, I want you to consider, what is your body trying to tell you? Where in your body do you hold tension, pain, exhaustion? What symptoms keep appearing that medicine can't quite explain? What if those symptoms aren't failures of your body, but messages from your soul? You don't have to have answers right now. Just notice, just wonder, just allow the possibility that your body might be speaking a truth your mind isn't ready to hear. Because if your spirit is calling for freedom, it will use every communication channel available, and when all else fails, it will speak through your flesh. The restlessness was the first whisper. The dreams were the next letter. And now the body has begun to shout. The question is, are you ready to listen? Or will your spirit have to turn up the volume even more? You think about someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they call you that same day. You need guidance on a decision, and a book falls off a shelf, literally falls, and opens to exactly the page with the answer you needed. You're considering a major life change, and suddenly the universe seems to be screaming confirmation. A license plate with meaningful numbers, a stranger who says exactly what you needed to hear, 3 different people mentioning the same opportunity within a week, and you think, am I going crazy or is something happening here? Something is happening. Jung called it synchronicity, a causal, meaningful coincidence. Events that are connected not by cause and effect, but by meaning. And while skeptics will dismiss these as confirmation bias or the brain's pattern-seeking tendency, Jung understood they were something far more profound. Evidence that psyche and matter are not separate, but 2 aspects of a unified reality. And during periods of deep psychological transformation, during spiritual awakening, during what Jung called individuation, synchronicities don't just occur. They multiply, they intensify, they become impossible to ignore. This is the 4th sign that your spirit is calling for freedom. The external world begins to mirror your internal transformation. Coincidences pile up in ways that probability can't explain. The universe, or whatever you want to call the greater intelligence underlying reality, seems to be communicating directly with you, not through words but through the language of meaningful coincidence. And the message is always the same. You're on the right path. Keep going. Pay attention. You're not alone in this. Understanding synchronicity. Jung's revolutionary concept. To understand why synchronicities multiply during spiritual awakening, you need to understand what Jung meant by synchronicity in the first place. This wasn't mysticism for Jung, it was serious science, or at least an attempt to expand science's understanding of causality. In collaboration with quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli, Jung proposed that there are events in the universe connected not by mechanical cause and effect, but by meaning. Think about causality in the normal sense. You flip a light switch, electricity flows, the light turns on. Cause, effect, linear, mechanical, explainable. But synchronicity operates differently. Your internal psychological state, say, a powerful dream about a scarab beetle, coincides with an external event, an actual scarab beetle tapping on your window, with no causal connection between them. Jung experienced this exact event with a patient, and it became the catalyst for his synchronicity theory. How can this be possible? Jung's answer, informed by quantum physics, was that at the deepest level of reality, psyche and matter aren't separate. There's an underlying unified field. Jung called it the unus mundus, the one world, where inner and outer, subject and object, mind and matter, are aspects of a single reality. Most of the time, we don't perceive this unity. We experience ourselves as separate from the world, as isolated subjects observing an external object world. But during periods of intense psychological transformation, the boundary between inner and outer becomes more permeable. The unconscious becomes more active, more energized. And when the unconscious is activated, it can create ripples in the external world. Not through magic, not through some New Age manifestation technique, but through a principle that's built into the fabric of reality itself. Consciousness and matter are entangled. This sounds abstract, so let me make it concrete. When you're going through a spiritual awakening, when your spirit is calling for freedom, your psyche is undergoing massive reorganization. Old structures are breaking down. New patterns are emerging. The self, that organizing principle of wholeness, is becoming more active in your life. And when the self is active, it doesn't just work through internal psychological processes. It orchestrates external events. It creates conditions in your outer life that mirror and support your inner transformation. Synchronicities are how you know the self is at work. They're breadcrumbs leading you toward your authentic path. They're confirmations that you're aligned with something deeper than ego consciousness, and they're invitations to trust that there's an intelligence guiding your transformation, not from outside yourself, but from the deepest part of yourself, the self which is both personal and transpersonal, both individual and connected to the collective unconscious. 3 levels of synchronicity, from whisper to shout. Not all synchronicities are created equal. Jung observed that they come in different intensities, different frequencies, different levels of obviousness. And during spiritual awakening, they tend to escalate, moving from subtle to unmistakable as your transformation deepens. Level 1, subtle correspondence. These are the quiet synchronicities, easy to dismiss as coincidence. You think of a friend, they text you. You need information, and you overhear a conversation that provides it. You're contemplating a question, and a song on the radio speaks directly to it. These happen to everyone occasionally, but during awakening, they start happening daily, multiple times a day. And while each individual instance could be coincidence, the pattern becomes undeniable. Level 2, meaningful clusters. This is when synchronicities start appearing in clusters around specific themes or decisions. You're considering changing careers, and suddenly you meet 3 people in unrelated contexts who all made similar changes. You're wrestling with a question about your relationships, and in 1 week you encounter the same message in a book, a podcast, and a conversation with a stranger. The universe is no longer whispering, it's speaking clearly, through multiple channels, all pointing in the same direction. Level 3. Numinous events. These are the synchronicities that stop you in your tracks, that send chills down your spine, that feel impossible to explain away. Jung called these numinous, filled with spiritual significance, touching something sacred. Maybe you're at a crisis point, questioning everything, and something happens that's so perfectly timed, so impossibly relevant, so specific to your situation that it feels like direct communication from something greater. These are rare, but during deep transformation, they happen, and they change you. They shatter your materialist worldview. They prove to you experientially that reality is stranger and more meaningful than you thought. Let me share 3 examples, escalating in intensity, from my own experience and the experiences of people I've worked with. Example 1. The Book That Falls. Marcus was a software engineer, successful and logical, with no interest in spirituality or psychology. But at 35, he started experiencing the restlessness we talked about in Chapter 1. He couldn't understand it. His life was fine, objectively good even. But something was missing, and the feeling was becoming unbearable. He'd heard me mention Jung in passing and dismissed it as too woo-woo. But the restlessness drove him to explore. He was in a bookstore, not even looking for anything particular, just killing time. He walked past the psychology section and felt, this is how he described it, pulled toward it. Not in a mystical sense, just an inexplicable urge. He stood there looking at the shelves, and a book fell off. Just fell. Not because he touched it, not because someone bumped the shelf. It fell, landed at his feet, opened to a random page. The book was Man and His Symbols, Jung's most accessible work. And the page it opened to, the section on persona and shadow, on living inauthentically, on the restlessness that emerges when you're betraying your true nature. Marcus stood there reading that page in the aisle, and something clicked. He bought the book, read it in 2 days, and it became the catalyst for his entire transformation. Coincidence? Maybe. Books fall off shelves. But the timing, his first moment of being open to psychological exploration, and the precise content of that page, feeling like it was written specifically about his experience, that's level 1 synchronicity. Subtle enough to dismiss, but meaningful enough to pay attention to if you're open. Example 2. The 3 conversations. Alicia was in a marriage that was slowly suffocating her. Not abusive, not dramatically wrong, just fundamentally incompatible. But she'd been married for 12 years. They had a home, a life, shared friends. The idea of ending it felt impossible, terrifying, like admitting failure. She'd been in therapy with me for months, circling the question, stay or leave. Neither option felt right. Both felt impossible. Then, within 1 week, 1 single week, 3 different people in the 3 completely unrelated contexts shared their experiences of leaving marriages that looked fine, but felt dead. First, a colleague at work mentioned it in passing during a lunch conversation that had nothing to do with relationships. Then her yoga instructor, whom she barely knew, shared her story after class. Then her aunt, whom she hadn't seen in a year, called out of the blue and spent an hour talking about her divorce 20 years prior and how it was the hardest and best decision she'd ever made. 3 times in 1 week. While Alicia was agonizing over this exact decision, each person describing similar dynamics, similar fears, and similar outcomes, pain in the short term, liberation in the long term. Alicia sat in my office and said, "It's like the universe is trying to tell me something." And I said, "It is. The question is whether you're going to listen." That's level 2 synchronicity. Not just one coincidence, but a cluster of meaningfully related events occurring in close temporal proximity around a specific question or crisis. The content is too specific, the timing too precise to easily dismiss. Something is orchestrating these encounters, and that something is the self, arranging external circumstances to support her individuation. Example 3. The number sequence. This is my own story, and I share it with some trepidation because it's the kind of thing that sounds unbelievable. But it happened, and it changed my understanding of reality. I was going through the darkest period of my individuation process. I'd left a career that was killing me, but I had no idea what came next. I was financially unstable, relationally isolated, existentially terrified. I questioned everything, whether the path I was on was real or delusion, whether Jung's psychology was profound or just another belief system I was clinging to, whether I was having a spiritual awakening or a protracted nervous breakdown. I reached a breaking point one night. I was alone, crying, asking, begging for a sign, any sign. I didn't believe in a God that answered prayers, but I asked anyway. I needed to know if I was on the right path or if I was destroying my life for nothing. The next morning, I woke up to my alarm, 11:11. Weird, but whatever. I got coffee, checked my phone. A text had arrived at 11:11 the night before. I went for a walk to clear my head, past a building. Its address was 11:11. I stopped at a bookstore, picked up a book at random, opened it, page 111. I bought groceries later. The total was $111. 11. I got home, checked my email. One had arrived at exactly 1:11 p.m. By the end of the day, I'd encountered the number sequence 1111 or 111 17 times. 17 times in one day, and I wasn't looking for it. After the first few, I was actively trying to ignore it, telling myself I was creating patterns where none existed, but they kept appearing. In contexts where I had no control, times, addresses, page numbers, prices, license plates. I researched it later. In numerology and various spiritual traditions, 1111 is considered a wake-up call number, a sign of spiritual awakening, an indication that you're on the right path even when it doesn't feel like it. But whether you believe in numerology or not is irrelevant. What mattered was the experience, the undeniable sense that reality was responding to my question, that consciousness wasn't isolated inside my skull, but was in dialogue with the world. That's level 3 synchronicity, numinous, reality shattering, the kind of experience that you can't explain away, that changes your fundamental understanding of what's possible. And it doesn't happen randomly. It happens when you're at a threshold, when you're ready to give up, when you need confirmation that you're not alone and not crazy. The self steps in, not with words but with signs, signal or noise, distinguishing synchronicity from apophenia. Here's the problem. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. It's evolved to find patterns because patterns meant survival, recognizing the pattern of a predator's movement, the pattern of edible plants, the pattern of weather changes. But this same capacity can become pathological. Apophenia is the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data, seeing Jesus in toast, finding secret messages in song lyrics played backward, believing every number sequence has cosmic significance. So how do you distinguish genuine synchronicity from pattern-seeking gone haywire? This is crucial because during spiritual awakening, when you're psychologically vulnerable and desperately seeking meaning, you can fall into magical thinking. You can start seeing signs everywhere, attributing meaning to everything, living in a constant state of over-interpretation that disconnects you from grounded reality. Jung was aware of this danger. He emphasized several criteria for genuine synchronicity. 1. Subjective certainty. A real synchronicity has a quality of numinosity. It hits differently. It resonates in your body, your gut, your soul. It's not just intellectually interesting. It's emotionally and spiritually impactful. You know it means something, not because you're forcing meaning onto it, but because the meaning is self-evident. 2. Temporal proximity. Genuine synchronicities cluster in time. They happen in close succession, creating a sense of urgency or momentum. If you're finding signs scattered across months with no pattern, that's more likely apophenia. But if they pile up in days or weeks around a specific crisis or decision, pay attention. 3. Relevance to current psychological state. The content of the synchronicity should be meaningfully related to what you're going through. Marcus's book, Falling Open to the Page about persona, wasn't just any random page. It was the exact content he needed. The specificity matters. 4. Unpredictability and lack of manipulation. You can't force synchronicities. The moment you start looking for them, trying to manufacture them, interpreting everything as a sign, you've left synchronicity and entered magical thinking. Real synchronicities happen when you're not looking, when you can't control the variables, when there's no way you could have engineered the coincidence. 5. Integration with rational understanding. Synchronicities shouldn't replace logic and discernment. They're supplemental information, not primary decision-making tools. If a synchronicity contradicts all practical wisdom, all ethical considerations, all grounded assessment of reality, be skeptical. The self doesn't ask you to abandon reason. It asks you to expand beyond reason to include meaning. If a supposed synchronicity doesn't meet most of these criteria, hold it lightly. Notice it, but don't build your life around it. The danger of apophenia during spiritual awakening is real. People make terrible decisions, abandon responsibilities, hurt others, all because they misinterpreted noise as signal. What synchronicities reveal about your readiness? Here's something Jung understood that most people miss. Synchronicities don't just happen to you randomly. Their appearance and intensity correlate with your psychological state. Specifically, they correlate with how ready you are to change, how open your unconscious is, how willing you are to follow where the self is leading. When you're rigid, defended, closed off, synchronicities are rare. Your ego is too fortified, your rational mind too dominant. You're not permeable to the unconscious, not open to the irrational, not willing to see meaning beyond mechanism. So the self doesn't waste energy trying to communicate that way. It uses other methods, symptoms, dreams, restlessness. But when you start to soften, when you become willing to consider that maybe reality is more mysterious than you thought, when you ask genuine questions and are open to receiving answers through unconventional channels, that's when synchronicities multiply. They're not a reward for openness. They're a natural consequence of it. The permeable boundary between your conscious mind and the unconscious, between your personal psyche and the collective unconscious, allows for these crossings between inner and outer. So if you're experiencing increased synchronicities, it means something about you has changed. You've become receptive. You've become porous to meaning. You've stepped onto the path of individuation, and the self is confirming, yes, this is the way. Keep going. You're not imagining this. The transformation is real. The collective unconscious as field. To really understand synchronicity, we need to touch on one of Jung's most controversial but important ideas, the collective unconscious. This isn't just your personal unconscious, your repressed memories, your shadow, your individual psyche. The collective unconscious is the shared substrate of human consciousness, containing archetypal patterns, primordial images, and instinctual wisdom that predates individual experience. Jung proposed that we're all connected through this collective unconscious, like nodes in a vast network. Most of the time, we're not aware of this connection. We experience ourselves as isolated individuals, but the connection is always there, underneath. And during certain states, deep meditation, psychedelic experiences, intense psychological crisis, spiritual awakening, the connection becomes more apparent. Synchronicities often involve other people in ways that suggest this collective connection. Alicia's 3 conversations weren't just about her receiving information. They were about 3 other people in different parts of her life, simultaneously being moved to share their stories. What coordinated that? How did her yoga instructor, who knew nothing about Alicia's marriage crisis, decide that particular day to share her divorce story? Jung would say the collective unconscious coordinated it. Alicia's psychological crisis created a kind of field effect, and other people tuned into that field unconsciously, became vehicles for the message herself needed her to receive. This sounds mystical, but quantum physics has shown us that non-local connections, entanglement across space, are real. Jung was proposing that consciousness has similar properties, that we're entangled not just physically, but psychically. When you're going through spiritual awakening, you're not just changing individually. You're sending ripples through the collective unconscious, and those ripples affect the people around you, draw certain people toward you, create coincidental meetings and conversations. You become a node of heightened consciousness in the network, and the network responds. Jung's ultimate teaching on synchronicity. Jung said, synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. The synchronicities were always there. Reality was always meaningful, always communicating, always showing you the connections between inner and outer. But you weren't looking. Your rational mind dismissed it. Your ego rejected it. Your materialist worldview had no place for it. Spiritual awakening isn't about the universe suddenly deciding to start sending you signs. It's about you finally developing eyes to see the signs that were always there. It's about your consciousness expanding enough to perceive layers of reality that were previously invisible to you. It's about moving from a mechanistic understanding of causality to a participatory understanding of meaning. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you experience one undeniable synchronicity, your entire relationship with reality shifts. You start to understand that you're not an isolated observer in a dead universe of random events. You're a participant in a living cosmos that speaks, that responds, that communicates, not in words, but in the language of meaningful coincidence. This changes everything. It changes how you make decisions. You don't just rely on logic anymore. You pay attention to signs, to intuition, to the way doors open or close. It changes how you relate to others. You start to notice who shows up in your life and when, understanding that there are no random encounters. It changes your relationship with suffering. Even painful events start to reveal their purpose, their place in the larger pattern of your individuation. But here's the warning I need to give you, and this is important. Synchronicities are not instructions. They're not commands from the universe that you must obey. They're information, they're data points. They're the self's way of getting your attention and saying, look here, this matters, pay attention. But you still have to use discernment, ethics, wisdom. You still have to integrate the synchronistic information with your rational mind, your moral compass, your understanding of consequences. I've seen people make terrible decisions because they misunderstood synchronicities as orders. I saw my ex's name 3 times today, so the universe is telling me to get back together with them, even though the relationship was toxic and they've done no healing work. I keep seeing signs about quitting my job, so I'm going to quit tomorrow. Even though they have no savings, no plan, no alternative. This isn't following synchronicities, it's abdicating responsibility. The self speaks through synchronicities, yes, but the self also expects you to use your ego functions, your reason, your discernment, your practical intelligence. Individuation isn't about transcending the ego, it's about right relating ego and self. The ego receives the signs from the self, but then it has to do the work of interpretation, of integration, of wise action. Your synchronicities are accelerating. What now? If you're reading this and recognizing that synchronicities have been multiplying in your life, what do you do with that information? How do you work with them without falling into either extreme, dismissing them as coincidence or over-interpreting them as cosmic directives? First, start documenting them. Keep a synchronicity journal. Write down the events, the timing, the meaning they seem to carry, how you felt when they occurred. This serves multiple purposes. It helps you see patterns over time. It prevents you from exaggerating or distorting memories. It gives you data to work with rather than vague impressions. And it creates a record of your journey, showing you how the self has been communicating with you all along. Second, work with them in therapy or analysis if you can. Share them with someone trained in Jungian psychology who won't dismiss them as delusion, but also won't inflate their importance. A good analyst will help you decode the symbolic meaning, connect the synchronicities to your current psychological process, and distinguish signal from noise. Third, respond to them with action, but thoughtful action. If synchronicities are pointing you toward something, take steps in that direction, but measured steps. You don't have to quit your job tomorrow because you saw a sign, but maybe you start exploring alternatives. You update your resume, you have conversations, you gather information. The synchronicities show you direction. You walk the path one step at a time. Fourth, trust the process even when synchronicities quiet down. They tend to cluster during intense transformation periods, but then they ebb. Don't panic when they slow or stop. It doesn't mean you're off path or that the universe has abandoned you. It might mean you've received the message, you've made the necessary changes, and now it's time for integration, rather than more signs. The self doesn't need to keep shouting once you've started listening. And finally, let them change your worldview. Don't intellectually compartmentalize synchronicities as interesting phenomena while continuing to live as a materialist. Let them fundamentally shift how you understand reality. Let them open you to mystery, to meaning, to the possibility that consciousness is more fundamental than matter, that psyche and world are two aspects of one thing, that you're connected to everything in ways science hasn't yet fully mapped. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the religious function of the psyche. Not religion as dogma or institution, but religion in the original sense. Religio, to bind back, to reconnect. Synchronicities bind you back to the sacred dimension of existence. They reconnect you to the numinous. They prove experientially what no amount of philosophy can prove intellectually, that life is meaningful, that consciousness is primary, that you're not alone. Marcus, the engineer who dismissed Jung as too woo-woo, had his worldview completely restructured by synchronicities. After the book fell, after he started reading Jung, the synchronicities accelerated. He'd think of a concept he didn't understand, and someone would recommend a lecture explaining it. He'd feel stuck in his transformation, and he'd meet someone going through something similar who'd share exactly what worked for them. Numbers started appearing, not 1111 like me, but 44, which he later learned in Jungian numerology relates to structure and foundation, perfect for an engineer needing to rebuild his life's structure. Within 6 months, this hardcore rationalist who'd built his identity on logic and empiricism had become someone who trusted synchronicity as much as data, not instead of data, alongside it. He didn't abandon his engineering mind. He expanded it to include another way of knowing. And that expansion, that both and instead of either or, is the hallmark of individuation. You don't reject rationality, you subordinate it to something larger. You don't dismiss science, you contextualize it within a more comprehensive understanding of reality. Alicia ended up leaving her marriage, but not immediately after the 3 conversations. She spent another 6 months in therapy, working through her fears, planning the logistics, making sure she was making the choice from clarity rather than compulsion. But those synchronicities gave her permission to take the question seriously, to stop dismissing her unhappiness as ingratitude, to consider that maybe her soul knew something her social conditioning didn't want to admit. And the synchronicities continued after she left. She'd worry she'd made a terrible mistake, and she'd encounter exactly the reassurance she needed. She'd feel guilty about disrupting her ex-husband's life, and she'd get information showing he was actually thriving post-divorce. She'd fear financial instability, and unexpected opportunities would appear. It wasn't magic. She was still doing the work, still taking responsibility, still facing consequences. But she wasn't doing it alone. The self was walking with her, confirming through external signs that the internal knowing was real. The meta pattern, synchronicities about synchronicities. Here's something strange that happens once you start paying attention to synchronicities. You start having synchronicities about synchronicities. You'll be thinking about whether a particular coincidence was meaningful, and you'll encounter information about synchronicity itself. You'll be questioning whether you're over-interpreting, and you'll have an experience so undeniable it erases doubt. You'll be teaching someone else about Jung's synchronicity principle, and one will occur right in front of both of you. This happened to me while writing this very script. I was working on this chapter, struggling to articulate why synchronicities matter, and I took a break to get coffee. In the coffee shop, two strangers sitting next to me were having a conversation about Carl Jung, about synchronicity specifically. I hadn't seen these people before. I haven't seen them since. But there they were, discussing the exact concept I was trying to explain, using examples that solved my writing problem. Coincidence? Maybe. But the quality of the experience, the perfect timing, the specificity of the content, it felt like the universe winking at me, confirming, yes, this matters. Keep writing. People need this. And whether that was literally true or whether it was my unconscious creating the experience to motivate me doesn't actually matter. The effect was the same. Renewed purpose, confirmation of meaning, connection to something larger. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create symbols and experiences that bridge conscious and unconscious, that transcend the rational-irrational divide. Synchronicities are perhaps the most dramatic expression of the transcendent function, occurring not just in your inner world, but in the intersection of inner and outer psyche and world. When synchronicities multiply around you, what's really happening is that the transcendent function is activated. Your psyche is in high gear, creating the conditions for transformation. The symbols and signs appearing in your external life are manifestations of the same archetypal processes happening in your internal life. You're not just changing psychologically, you're changing ontologically. Your way of being in the world, your relationship with reality itself, is transforming. And once this process begins, once you've stepped onto the path of individuation and the self has begun orchestrating synchronicities, there's no going back. You can try to return to your old materialist worldview, but it won't fit anymore. It's like trying to believe in a flat Earth after you've seen the curvature from space. The experience has shown you something your theories can't explain away. Living in synchronistic reality. So what does life look like when you fully embrace synchronistic reality? Does it mean becoming flaky, impractical, living in your head, disconnected from grounded reality? No, in fact, the opposite. People who understand synchronicity deeply often become more effective in the world, not less, because they're operating with more information. They're reading both the visible level, facts, data, logic, and the invisible level, meaning pattern, purpose. They make better decisions because they're consulting multiple sources of wisdom, rational analysis, and intuitive knowing. strategic planning, and synchronistic confirmation. They're more resilient because they trust that even apparent setbacks are part of a larger pattern they don't yet fully see. They're more creative because they're permeable to the unconscious, receiving inspiration and insight from depths their rational mind can't access. But they're also more grounded because they understand that synchronicities are information, not magic. They still pay their bills, meet their obligations, consider consequences. They don't use "the universe will provide" as an excuse for irresponsibility. They understand that the self guides but the ego implements. That meaning doesn't negate effort, that you still have to walk the path even when signs point the way. This integration of synchronistic awareness and practical responsibility is the goal. Not to escape the material world into a fantasy of cosmic significance, but to live in the material world while remaining aware of the numinous dimension threading through it. To be simultaneously pragmatic and mystical, grounded and open, rational and receptive. Jung lived this integration. He was a psychiatrist, a scientist, a scholar, rigorous, careful, methodical. And he was also someone who paid attention to dreams, who experienced visions, who took synchronicities seriously, who understood that reality contained layers that empiricism alone couldn't access. He didn't choose between these modes. He held both, and in that tension, he created a psychology that honors both scientific rigor and spiritual depth. That's what synchronicities are calling you toward. Not away from the real world, but into a richer understanding of what real means. Not into delusion, but into a more comprehensive relationship with reality that includes both the measurable and the meaningful, both the causal and the acausal, both the objective and the subjective. The synchronicity that brought you here. Before we move to the fifth sign, I want to point out one more synchronicity. The fact that you're here, reading this, right now. How did you find this video? What led you to it? Was it recommended by the algorithm? And if so, why did the algorithm decide this was relevant to you at this moment? Did someone send it to you? And if so, what made them think of you when they encountered it? Did you search for it? And if so, what drove that search? Trace back the chain of events that brought you to these words. Chances are you'll find a series of seemingly small coincidences that, when viewed together, create a pattern. You were ready for this information. Your spirit was calling for freedom, sending you the signs we've been discussing: restlessness, dreams, physical symptoms, and then, through whatever route, you encountered content about those exact signs. That's not random. That's synchronicity. Your unconscious knows what you need before your conscious mind does. And it creates conditions, both internal and external, to bring you into contact with what you need. The self guided you here, whether through algorithm or recommendation or search or impulse. And now you're here, and the question is, what will you do with this information? Will you dismiss it as interesting but ultimately meaningless? Will you overinflate it into proof that you're special or chosen? Or will you hold it appropriately as confirmation that you're on a journey, that the signs are real, that your awakening isn't delusion but the most real thing you've ever experienced? Jung said, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." You're developing those eyes. The synchronicities are multiplying because you're becoming capable of perceiving them, and they're showing you that the journey you're on toward freedom, toward authenticity, toward wholeness, is supported by something far larger than your individual will. The universe is not indifferent. Reality is not dead. Consciousness is not contained inside your skull. You're part of a living, meaning-making cosmos that speaks to those who learn its language. And synchronicity is one of its primary dialects. So pay attention. Document the signs. Hold them with discernment. Let them guide you without letting them control you. And trust that if you're meant to take a step, The path will reveal itself not just through your careful planning, but through the meaningful coincidences that confirm, yes, this way, keep going, you're not alone. The synchronicities are accelerating. That's the fourth sign. But they're accelerating toward what? Toward a confrontation that many people try desperately to avoid. A recognition that most of our relationships are built on masks rather than reality. And that brings us to the fifth sign, perhaps the most socially devastating of all. The sudden intolerance for superficiality. You're at a party surrounded by people you've known for years, and suddenly you can't do it anymore. The small talk feels suffocating. The performative laughter rings hollow. Everyone's wearing masks, playing roles, saying things they don't mean to people who aren't really listening, and you can see it. You can see through it all, and it's making you physically ill. You excuse yourself, claim a headache, leave early, and on the drive home, you realize with creeping dread, I can't go back, not to that party, but to that way of being. Something has broken inside me, or maybe something has finally broken open, and I can't pretend anymore. This is the fifth sign that your spirit is calling for freedom. The sudden, visceral intolerance for superficiality. The conversations that used to be fine, talking about weather, sports, gossip, surface-level updates, now feel like violence against your soul. The relationships that used to be comfortable, friends you've had for years, family members you see at holidays, now feel like elaborate performances where everyone's pretending and no one's saying what's true. The social conventions you used to navigate easily, the polite deflections, the agreeable mask, the careful editing of yourself to fit in, now feel impossible to maintain. It's not that you've suddenly become judgmental, though people might accuse you of that. It's not that you think you're better than others, though your ego might try to twist it that way. It's that the persona, that social mask you've been wearing your entire life, is dying. And as it dies, it can no longer tolerate the environment that required it. The false self can't breathe in rooms full of other false selves. The emerging authentic you is allergic to inauthenticity. Jung called this phase the loneliness of individuation. Because here's the terrible truth, becoming authentic often means becoming alone. Most people aren't on this journey. Most people are comfortable in their personas, content in their masks, functioning perfectly well in superficial connection. And when you stop being able to do that, when you start demanding depth and reality and truth, many of those people will fall away. Not because they're bad people, but because your transformation is threatening to them. Your inability to wear the mask anymore implicitly questions why they're still wearing theirs. The death of the persona. Why masks become unbearable. To understand why this happens, we need to return to Jung's concept of the persona. Remember, the persona is necessary. It's the face you show to the world, the social adaptation that allows you to function in society. Children develop personas as a survival strategy. They learn what gets approval, what gets love, what keeps them safe. And for most of life, this works. The persona does its job. You fit in, you succeed, you're accepted. But the persona was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a starting point, not a destination. Jung believed that the first half of life is about building up the persona, establishing yourself in the world, achieving external success, creating an identity. But the second half of life, ideally, is about what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are beneath the mask. The problem is that most people never make this transition. They build the persona in the first half of life and then spend the second half defending it, maintaining it, becoming increasingly identified with it until they die having never met themselves. The persona becomes a prison and they don't even know they're imprisoned because it's all they've ever known. But when spiritual awakening begins, when your spirit starts calling for freedom, the persona can't hold anymore. It starts to crack. And those cracks are painful, terrifying, because the persona isn't just a mask you wear. It's become your identity. You think it's you. Your sense of self, your self-esteem, your entire social world is built around it. So when it starts to crumble, it feels like you're dying. In a sense, you are. The false self is dying, and that death is necessary for the true self to emerge. But death is death, even when it's psychological death, and it's agonizing. And one of the first casualties of this death is your ability to engage in superficial interaction. Think about it mechanically. Superficial interaction requires the persona. It requires you to play a role, to give the expected responses, to maintain the social script. But when the persona is breaking down, you can't do that anymore. It's not that you won't, though that becomes true too. It's that you can't. The mechanism that allowed superficial engagement has malfunctioned. You try to smile and nod and agree, and your face won't cooperate. You try to make small talk, and the words taste like ash in your mouth. Your body rejects it at a cellular level. This is your psyche protecting you. The persona is dying because it needs to die, and superficial relationships feed the persona, keep it alive, reinforce the illusion that the mask is you. So your unconscious creates an allergic reaction to superficiality. It makes it uncomfortable, unbearable even. So you'll stop doing it. So you'll stop feeding the false self and start starving it, making room for the true self to emerge. Michael's story, when the social circle implodes. Let me tell you about Michael. Michael was a corporate VP, successful by all external measures with an extensive social circle. He and his wife were always at events, networking dinners, charity galas, cocktail parties, country club gatherings. He was charming, socially adept, always knew what to say. His persona was polished to a shine. Then, at 42, something shifted. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what triggered it. Maybe it was cumulative, maybe it was the death of his father, maybe it was just time. But he started noticing things he'd never noticed before. At parties, he'd watch people interact and realize no one was actually connecting. They were exchanging information, networking, posturing, but no one was really present. No one was being real. He tried to have deeper conversations. He'd ask people questions that went beneath the surface. How are you really? What's alive in you right now? What's the hardest thing you're dealing with? And people would look at him like he'd violated some unspoken rule. They'd give surface answers and change the subject. Or they'd laugh uncomfortably and say, "Wow, getting deep tonight, huh?" and deflect back to small talk. Michael started to feel crazy. He'd leave these events feeling emptier than when he'd arrived. His wife would say, "That was fun, wasn't it?" And he'd realize, we have completely different definitions of fun. She'd enjoyed the performance, the social game. He'd felt like he was suffocating. He came to see me because his wife insisted. She was worried about him. He'd stopped wanting to attend their social events. He'd make excuses, claim work stress, show up late, and leave early. When he did attend, he was withdrawn, quiet, not his usual charismatic self. Their friends were asking if he was okay. His wife felt embarrassed, abandoned, angry. "What's wrong with you?" she'd ask. "You used to love this." And Michael would think, did I? Or did I love the version of me who was good at this? And now that version is dying, and I don't know who I am without it. This is the crisis, because Michael's entire identity, his entire social world, his marriage even, was built around the persona, the charming executive who could work a room, who had the right connections, who played the game excellently. But that persona was becoming intolerable to him. He couldn't perform it anymore, and everyone in his life, his wife, his friends, his colleagues, wanted the persona back. They wanted the Michael they knew. They weren't interested in whoever was emerging beneath the mask. The shadow side, spiritual superiority. Before we go further, I need to address the shadow side of this sign, because it's dangerous and common. When you start seeing through superficiality, when you start recognizing that most people are living behind masks, your ego can inflate this into spiritual superiority. You can start thinking, I'm awake and they're asleep. I'm deep and they're shallow. I'm evolving and they're stuck. This is not individuation. This is ego inflation masquerading as spiritual growth. And it's one of the most common traps people fall into during awakening. Jung warned about this extensively. The person who's begun the individuation process can become insufferable, arrogant, convinced of their own specialness. They mistake the death of the persona for superiority over others who still have personas. But here's the truth. Everyone is on their own journey. Not everyone is called to conscious individuation, and that doesn't make them less than. Most people live perfectly meaningful lives within their personas. Most people don't need to descend into the underworld of the unconscious to find fulfillment. And judging them for that is just another form of persona, the spiritually awakened person persona, which is no more authentic than the corporate VP persona. The intolerance for superficiality, when it's healthy, isn't about judgment. It's about capacity. You're not thinking, these people are inferior. You're feeling, I can't do this anymore. This doesn't feed me. This isn't where I belong right now. There's no moral superiority in that, just honest recognition of what you need. Michael struggled with this. In our sessions, he'd vent about his social circle. They're so fake. They care about the stupidest things. Who's buying what house? Whose kid got into what school? Who made partner? Don't they realize none of it matters? And I'd ask him, are you angry at them or are you grieving? And he'd sit with that and realize, I'm grieving. I'm grieving the loss of a social world I used to belong to. I'm grieving the relationships that were built on a version of me that's dying. I'm grieving the fact that I can't go back. That shift from judgment to grief is crucial. When you can grieve instead of judge, when you can feel the sadness of outgrowing relationships instead of feeling superior to the people in them, that's when you know your intolerance for superficiality is healthy. That's when you know it's the self guiding you away from what no longer serves rather than the ego inflating itself above others. The authentic communication protocol. So what do you do when you can't engage superficially anymore, but you still have to function in the world? You can't just announce to everyone, I'm individuating now, so I'll only have deep conversations. Life doesn't work that way. You still have family gatherings, work functions, social obligations. How do you navigate this transitional period? Jung would say, you learn the art of conscious persona use. Remember, the persona itself isn't the enemy. The problem is unconscious identification with it, believing the mask is you. But if you wear the mask consciously, knowing it's a mask, knowing there's a you beneath it, then it becomes a tool rather than a prison. This is a nuanced skill. In professional settings, you might still need to engage in small talk, network, play certain roles, but you're doing it consciously now, strategically, without losing yourself in it. You're like an actor who knows they're acting. You can perform the role when necessary, without believing you are the role. But in your personal life, in relationships that matter, you start practicing what I call the authentic communication protocol. Here's the framework. Step 1. Test the waters. Before assuming a relationship can't handle depth, test it. Instead of surface conversation, try going one level deeper. Ask real questions. Share something true. See how the person responds. You might be surprised. Some people are desperate for realness and are just waiting for someone else to go first. Step 2. Honor where people are. If someone can't meet you at depth, don't force it. Don't make them wrong. Recognize that they're on their own journey, and they might not be at a place where deep psychological work is relevant. You can still care about them, still have compassion, still maintain the relationship, just with clearer boundaries about what that relationship can provide. Step 3. Find your people. Actively seek out relationships with people who are also doing this work, who also value depth, who also refuse to live behind masks. This might mean joining groups focused on inner work, attending workshops or retreats, finding a good therapist or analyst, engaging in communities built around conscious growth. These become your tribe, your soul family, the people who get it. Step 4. Communicate your changes with people you're close to, partners, family, longtime friends. Be honest about what's happening. I'm going through a transformation. I'm changing in ways that are hard to explain. I need different things from relationships now, more honesty, more depth, less performance. I know this affects you, and I'm sorry for the disruption, but I can't not do this. This is vulnerable, scary communication, and not everyone will understand or accept it. But the people who truly love you, not the persona, will try. They might struggle, might resist at first, but if there's real care underneath, they'll work with you to evolve the relationship, rather than demanding you stay who you've always been. Michael eventually had this conversation with his wife. It didn't go well at first. She felt betrayed, confused, angry. From her perspective, he was destroying their life for no reason. She hadn't signed up for a husband who questioned everything, who didn't want to attend the events that were important to her, who was becoming someone she didn't recognize. They did couples therapy, and slowly, painfully, they began to have real conversations, maybe the first real conversations of their marriage. And what emerged was startling. She wasn't happy either. She'd been playing her role, performing her persona, succeeding at the life they'd built. But beneath it, she was just as empty. She'd just been better at ignoring it. Michael's awakening, his intolerance for superficiality, his refusal to keep wearing the mask, it threatened her because it exposed the lie she was also living. And once that was exposed, she had a choice. Double down on the persona, insist on superficiality, protect the comfortable lie. Or take the risk of removing her own mask, meeting him in truth, building something real, even if it meant leaving behind the life they'd created. She chose the latter, not immediately, not easily, but eventually. And their relationship didn't just survive, it transformed. They lost most of their social circle. They stopped attending the events that felt like theater. They rebuilt their life around what was actually real for them, not what looked good to others. And yes, it was lonely at first. Yes, it was scary. Yes, there were losses. But what they gained, genuine connection, authentic presence, the experience of being truly known, was worth everything they released. The collective dimension, your authenticity heals the collective. There's something important we need to understand about this sign, about the intolerance for superficiality. It's not just about you. When you refuse to wear the mask anymore, when you start being real, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's costly, you're not just liberating yourself. You're creating permission for others to do the same. Jung believed that the work of individuation wasn't selfish, it was service. Every person who becomes conscious, who integrates their shadow, who dares to be authentic, raises the consciousness of the collective. Because we're all connected through the collective unconscious, your transformation ripples outward. Your refusal to be superficial gives others permission to question their own superficiality. Your authenticity invites others into their own. Think about Michael's story. His wife wasn't on a conscious path toward awakening until his awakening forced the issue. His refusal to maintain his persona created a crisis that ultimately liberated both of them. His intolerance for superficiality didn't just change him, it changed their relationship, changed her, and then changed how they both showed up in the world. And the people who fell away from their life. Some of them reached out years later, confessing that watching Michael's transformation had planted seeds in them. They'd been confused, maybe judgmental at the time, but they'd also been curious, maybe envious. They'd watched someone have the courage to stop performing, and it had made them question their own performance. Michael didn't set out to change anyone else. He was just trying to save his own soul. But the ripple effects were real. This is how collective consciousness evolves, not through mass movements or collective action, but through individuals who dare to become conscious, one at a time. And the intolerance for superficiality is a crucial stage in that process, because it's the point where your internal transformation demands external manifestation. You can't keep your awakening private anymore. It has to affect how you show up, who you surround yourself with, what you tolerate, and what you don't. The warning: don't sever prematurely. But I need to give you a warning, because I've seen people make this mistake and regret it. Don't burn bridges impulsively. Don't sever relationships in a fit of spiritual awakening zeal. Don't decide overnight that everyone in your life is superficial and cut them all off. Remember, you're going through a process. You're in transition. The intolerance for superficiality can be temporarily inflated during the acute phase of transformation. What feels intolerable today might feel more nuanced in 6 months when you've integrated more of the change. Some relationships that seem impossible now might evolve. Some people who seem unable to meet you in depth might surprise you when given time and space. So, move slowly. Create distance where you need it, but don't necessarily create permanent separation. Test relationships. Communicate honestly. Give people a chance to meet you in your evolution. Some will, some won't. But you don't have to decide that all at once. Michael made this mistake initially. In the early phase of his awakening, he decided his entire social circle was toxic and cut everyone off. He and his wife stopped returning calls, stopped accepting invitations, essentially ghosted their entire community. And while some of that separation was necessary, some of it was premature. A few of those friendships could have evolved if given the chance. A few of those people were also questioning the superficiality and might have become allies on the journey. So he had to do repair work later, reaching back out, apologizing for the abruptness, testing whether genuine connection was possible now. Some people welcomed him back, some didn't. But he learned. Individuation isn't about creating separation. It's about creating authenticity within connection. Sometimes that requires distance, but not always permanent severance. Who in your life can't handle the real you? Before we move to the 6th sign, sit with this question. Who in your life can't handle the real you? Not the persona, not the performance, not the version of you that says yes when you mean no and laughs when nothing's funny. The real you, messy, complex, uncertain, growing, changing, refusing to perform anymore. Make a list if it helps. Not to judge these people, not to cut them off, but to get honest about the current state of your relationships. How many of them are built on authenticity? How many are built on mutual performance? How many could survive your transformation? How many are actually ready to die alongside your false self? This isn't comfortable work. You might realize that your entire life is structured around superficiality, that your marriage, your friendships, your professional identity, all of it was built by and for the persona. And now the persona is dying and the structure is shaking, and you don't know what survives. But this is necessary. This is the loneliness of individuation that Jung warned about. You're being called out of the collective into your own truth, and that journey is, by its nature, solitary, not forever. Eventually you find new connections, deeper connections, soul-level relationships with people who can meet you in authenticity. But there's a wilderness period in between, a period of letting go before you know what you're moving toward. And the intolerance for superficiality is the sign that you've entered that wilderness. The old world has become intolerable. The new world hasn't fully emerged, and you're in the in-between, uncomfortable and alone and wondering if you've made a terrible mistake. You haven't. The loneliness is temporary, the authenticity is permanent, and the people who can't handle the real you, they were never your people. They were the persona's people, and as the persona dies, they fall away, making room for soul connections that actually feed you instead of drain you. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he never said it was easy. He never said it wouldn't cost you. And one of the costs is this: the social world you knew, the relationships you had, the version of connection that felt comfortable. Much of it won't survive. But what replaces it, if you're brave enough to keep going, is worth every loss. The intolerance for superficiality is accelerating. You can't go back to polite pretense, to comfortable masks, to relationships built on lies we agree not to name. And that intolerance is about to deepen into something even more intense, an obsessive need to question everything. That's the sixth sign, and it's where many people get lost in the dissolution. Let's go there next. The unbearable lightness of superficial being. There's a moment that happens at parties, networking events, family gatherings, those social spaces where human beings gather under the pretense of connection, but actually engage in something closer to collective dissociation. Someone approaches you with that familiar social smile, that rehearsed energy, and asks, "So what do you do?" And something inside you doesn't just resist answering, it physically recoils. Your chest tightens, your throat constricts. You feel an almost violent urge to either tell them the absolute truth about the existential crisis you're navigating, or simply walk away without explanation. This isn't rudeness, this isn't social anxiety, this isn't even introversion, though it might disguise itself that way. This is yourself, that deeper organizing intelligence Jung identified as the totality of the psyche, categorically refusing to fragment your consciousness into social performance anymore. And once this refusal begins, small talk doesn't just bore you, it becomes existentially intolerable. It feels like dying. Let me be extremely clear about what's happening here, because this sign gets misinterpreted constantly. This is not misanthropy. You haven't become a judgmental person who thinks they're too evolved for ordinary conversation. In fact, if you're experiencing this authentically, you're probably horrified by your own reaction. You remember when you could do small talk effortlessly. You remember when you actually enjoyed the lightness of superficial exchange, the social lubrication of meaningless pleasantries. You want to access that ease again, but you can't, because something fundamental has shifted in your relationship to consciousness itself. Jung spent considerable time examining what he called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of your psychological type that usually operates unconsciously. For many people navigating the social world, the inferior function is introverted feeling. They've built their lives on extroverted thinking, strategy, performance, social calculation, managing impressions. They've become experts at the external game. But when spiritual awakening begins, the inferior function stops being inferior. It rises up with tremendous force, demanding its due. An introverted feeling has exactly zero interest in social games. Introverted feeling wants truth, not capital T metaphysical truth necessarily, but authentic subjective truth. It wants to know, what do you actually feel? What do you actually value? What actually matters to you beneath the roles you're performing? And when you're operating from this function, questions like, how's work, or did you see the game, don't just feel trivial. They feel like existential violations. They feel like someone is asking you to voluntarily amputate a piece of your soul to fit into their comfort zone. The story of David, the salesman who couldn't sell anymore. Let me tell you about David, a composite of several people I've worked with who experienced this particular sign with devastating intensity. David was a sales executive for a pharmaceutical company, successful by every conventional metric: six-figure income, company car, impressive title. He'd built his entire professional identity on his ability to network, to charm, to make people feel comfortable enough to trust him with their business. He was, by his own description, a professional friend. David attended a conference in Las Vegas, one of those massive industry events with thousands of attendees, open bars, and endless opportunities for meaningful connections. He'd been to dozens of these before. He knew the rhythms, the strategies, the unspoken rules. But on the second night, standing in a crowded hotel ballroom with a drink in his hand, listening to a potential client talk about his golf handicap, David felt something snap inside him. He described it as a sudden, overwhelming awareness that every word coming out of his mouth was a lie. Not factually false, but existentially dishonest. He was saying things he didn't mean, laughing at jokes he didn't find funny, performing interest in topics that meant absolutely nothing to him. And for the first time in his 43 years, he couldn't maintain the performance. His face went blank, his throat closed. The client asked if he was feeling all right, and David, this man who'd made a career of smooth responses, couldn't even produce a polite deflection. He walked out of the ballroom, out of the hotel, into the Las Vegas night with its artificial brightness and manufactured energy, and he kept walking. He walked for 3 hours, and with every step, he felt a grief so profound he couldn't name it. He was grieving his own disappearance. He was grieving the decades he'd spent fragmenting himself into whatever shape the moment required. He was grieving the person he'd become, someone who'd gotten so good at not being himself that he'd forgotten there was a self beneath the performance. David called me 2 weeks later, after he'd returned home but couldn't return to work. He'd been sitting in his car in the parking lot of his office building every morning for a week, unable to make himself walk through the doors. "I don't understand what's wrong with me," he said. "I used to love this job. I used to be good at it. Now the thought of having one more conversation about quarterly projections makes me want to drive off a cliff. Am I having a breakdown?" I asked him a question Jung often posed to his patients. What if nothing is wrong with you? What if something is finally right? The persona's exhaustion versus the self's authenticity. Here's what David was experiencing, what anyone going through this sign experiences. The persona, Jung's term for the social mask we wear, the acceptable face we present to the collective, had exhausted itself, not because David wasn't good at maintaining it, but because the self underneath was done being hidden. The persona is necessary. Let's be clear about that. You need a social interface. You need the ability to modulate your presentation based on context. The persona is what allows you to function in society without overwhelming every interaction with your complete psychological complexity. Jung never suggested we should destroy the persona, but he did warn that the persona becomes pathological when you mistake it for your actual identity, when you can no longer distinguish between the role you're playing and the player underneath. And here's the mechanism that makes small talk intolerable. Small talk is persona feeding. It's the maintenance protocol for social masks. When you engage in superficial conversation, you're essentially oiling the hinges of your constructed identity. You're reinforcing the patterns of acceptable communication. You're staying safely within the boundaries of collective consciousness. And that's fine, necessary even, when you have a healthy relationship between ego and self, between persona and authenticity. But when spiritual awakening begins, when the self starts demanding conscious recognition, it cannot and will not tolerate persona maintenance anymore, because every moment spent in superficial exchange is a moment stolen from the deep work of psychological integration. Every cocktail party conversation about weather and sports scores is time the self could be using to communicate through dreams, through symptoms, through synchronicities that carry actual meaning. Your psyche is trying to undergo a radical transformation, and you're asking it to discuss traffic patterns. Your soul is trying to communicate something essential about your unlived life, and you're forcing it to care about celebrity gossip. The intolerance you feel isn't snobbery. It's your organism's natural immune response to psychological poison, the collective consciousness's addiction to distraction. Now let's zoom out and understand why the collective actively maintains superficiality as the default setting for human interaction. Because this isn't accidental. The collective consciousness, that vast shared field of assumptions, values, and behavioral norms that Jung identified as the substrate of social reality, has a vested interest in keeping people distracted from depth. Why? Because depth is dangerous. Depth is destabilizing. When people start asking real questions, when they start examining the assumptions underlying their lives, when they start wondering whether their careers, relationships, and values actually serve their authentic development, the entire social structure becomes unstable. The collective depends on unconsciousness. It depends on people staying committed to their roles, maintaining their personas, participating in the agreed-upon fiction that surface living is sufficient. Small talk is the collective's most effective tool for maintaining this unconsciousness. It's not neutral, it's not harmless, it's actively sedating. Every "how's the weather?", every "what's new?", every superficial exchange reinforces the implicit message: stay on the surface. Don't go deep. Don't ask hard questions. Don't risk actual connection. Don't threaten the comfortable numbness we've all agreed to maintain. And for most people, most of the time, this works perfectly. They navigate their entire lives in the shallow end of consciousness. They have real pain, real joy, real complexity, but it all stays private, unexamined, unexpressed. They mistake loneliness for solitude. They mistake distraction for contentment. They mistake persona for personality. And they die without ever meeting themselves. But you, the person experiencing this sign, you can't do that anymore. You've touched something deeper, maybe through crisis, maybe through pain, maybe through some inexplicable grace. But you've felt what it's like when consciousness actually meets consciousness, when soul actually recognizes soul. And now, surface living doesn't just feel empty, it feels like active self-betrayal, the social cost of depth. Let's talk about what happens next, because this is where it gets brutal. When you can no longer tolerate small talk, you start becoming socially inconvenient. Not dramatically, not in ways that are easy to point to, but people start sensing that something's off about you. You're not playing the game correctly anymore. You're not maintaining the social contract. At first, they try to pull you back in. They ask if you're okay. They express concern. They suggest you might be depressed, stressed, working too hard. Because the collective's first response to deviation is always rehabilitation. Bring the outlier back into the fold. Restore the equilibrium. And if you're lucky, if you have genuine friends, they'll do this from a place of authentic care. But even authentic care can't bridge the gap that's opening, because what they're concerned about isn't actually your well-being. What they're concerned about is your absence from the shared fiction. They need you to keep pretending that small talk matters, because your pretending validates their pretending. Your willingness to engage in superficial exchange confirms that they're not wasting their lives in superficial exchange. Your participation in the collective trance makes their trance feel like reality. When you withdraw that participation, even subtly, you become a mirror. And nobody likes what they see in that mirror. They see their own evasion, their own cowardice, their own refusal to ask the hard questions. And rather than face that reflection, most people will simply decide you're the problem. You've become too intense, too serious, too difficult. You've lost your sense of humor. You need to lighten up. You need to relax. You need to, and this is the phrase they'll actually use, get over yourself. David experienced this with shocking swiftness. Within 3 months of his Las Vegas incident, his entire social network had reconfigured around his absence. The colleagues who used to invite him to golf tournaments stopped calling. The friends who used to include him in weekend plans quietly excluded him. His own wife started making comments about how he'd changed, how he wasn't fun anymore, how she missed the old David. And David found himself in the loneliest position imaginable, surrounded by people who'd known him for decades, but utterly alone. Because the person they'd known, the person they missed, the person they wanted back, that person wasn't him. That person was his persona, and his persona was dead. It had exhausted itself through sheer inauthenticity, and no amount of social pressure could resurrect it. Why surface living feels like dying once you've touched depth. Here's the psychological mechanism that makes this irreversible. Once consciousness expands, it cannot contract. Not genuinely. You can pretend to go back to sleep. You can force yourself to engage in superficial conversations. You can maintain the social routines, but you know you're pretending, and that knowing, that meta-consciousness, that awareness of your own performance makes everything worse, because now you're not just living superficially, you're consciously choosing superficiality while knowing depth exists. Jung described this as the torture of the educated consciousness. Once you know there's a deeper dimension to existence, once you've experienced what it feels like when your psyche touches something true, something essential, something that actually matters, surface living becomes a form of slow death, not metaphorical death, actual death of the soul. Every small talk conversation becomes a tiny suicide. Every superficial exchange is a betrayal of the self you're trying to become. And your body knows this. Your body registers this as existential threat. That's why you have physical responses, the chest tightening, the throat closing, the overwhelming urge to flee. Your organism is trying to protect you from psychological annihilation. It's saying, this interaction is dangerous. This exchange will kill something essential in you. Get out, now. This is why people who experience this sign often withdraw from social situations entirely. Not because they're antisocial, but because socializing has become traumatic. Every party is an endurance test. Every family gathering is psychological warfare. Every networking event is an invitation to fragment yourself into acceptable pieces. And after a while, isolation starts feeling like self-preservation. Loneliness starts feeling safer than the violence of maintaining a dying persona in crowds of unconscious people. The sacred refusal. But here's what I want you to understand if you're experiencing this. Your intolerance for small talk isn't a problem to be fixed. It's a message to be honored. It's yourself drawing a boundary. It's your psyche saying no more. No more fragmentation. No more performance. No more betrayal of depth for the comfort of shallowness. This is a sacred refusal, and sacred refusals always look like pathology from the outside. They always appear as dysfunction, as failure to adapt, as inability to meet basic social requirements. But from the inside, from the perspective of psychological development, this refusal is absolutely necessary. It's the only way to stop feeding the false self, so the true self has room to emerge. Jung had a term for this phase of individuation, the hermit stage. It's the period where you must withdraw from collective consciousness to hear your own voice, to distinguish your thoughts from the thoughts you've inherited, to separate your values from the values you've been conditioned to accept. And during this stage, small talk isn't just annoying, it's actively destructive. It pulls you back into the collective trance when you need to be establishing individual consciousness. David eventually understood this, though it took him nearly 2 years. 2 years of social isolation, career upheaval, marital strain, and profound psychological discomfort. But on the other side of that discomfort, he found something he hadn't even known he was searching for: actual relationships. Not the performative connections of his sales career, but genuine soul-level recognition with 3, maybe 4 people who could meet him in depth. He described one of these relationships to me. I met this guy at a grief counseling group. Long story how I ended up there, and we got coffee afterwards. And I told him about my Vegas breakdown, about not being able to do my job anymore, about feeling like an alien in my own life. And you know what he said? He said, "Yeah, me too." That's it, just, "Yeah, me too." And I felt more seen in that moment than in 20 years of networking events. The integration, finding your depth people. This is the paradox you need to navigate. You can't tolerate superficiality anymore, but you still need connection. Humans are relational creatures. Even the most introverted individual requires some form of authentic contact with other consciousnesses. Isolation might be necessary temporarily, but it cannot be the endpoint. So how do you find connection when small talk has become intolerable? You look for what I call depth people. These are individuals who've also touched something deeper, who've also crossed the threshold from unconsciousness to consciousness, who've also paid the social price for refusing to maintain dead personas. You don't find them at networking events. You don't find them at cocktail parties. You find them in unexpected places: bookstores, hiking trails, meditation centers, grief counseling groups, philosophy meetups, creative workshops, places where people go when they're looking for meaning, not distraction. And the recognition, when it happens, is immediate. There's no small talk. You skip right past the surface. Someone says something real, something vulnerable, something true, and you know within 5 minutes whether this person can meet you where you are. Not because they're spiritual in some Instagram-approved way, not because they have the right vocabulary or the right practices, but because they've been through their own psychological death and rebirth. They've paid the price of consciousness, and they recognize that cost in you. These relationships are different. They're not based on shared hobbies or convenient proximity or social utility. They're based on mutual recognition at the soul level. And they're rare. Much rarer than you'd like. You might build 2 or 3 of these relationships in a decade if you're lucky, but they're worth more than 100 superficial friendships. Because in these relationships, you don't have to perform. You don't have to maintain your persona. You can be absolutely yourself, messy, contradictory, evolving, confused, and you're met with understanding rather than judgment. The question you need to answer. So let me ask you directly, and I want you to really sit with this question. What conversation topic makes you want to scream? Not which topics bore you, not which subjects you find uninteresting, but which conversations trigger that visceral response, the chest tightening, the throat closing, the desperate urge to escape. Because that reaction is diagnostic. It's your psyche showing you exactly where your consciousness has outgrown your life. It's yourself marking the boundary between authentic presence and hollow performance. For some of you, it's career talk. The endless discussions about promotions, office politics, industry trends. For others, it's relationship gossip. The who's dating who's getting divorced, who's having problems. For others still, it's cultural consumption. The what did you watch, what did you read, what do you think about the latest thing? Whatever it is for you, pay attention to it, because that topic represents the arena where your persona is most exhausted, where your false self has worked hardest to maintain the illusion, where your true self is most desperate to break through. And your intolerance, that sacred refusal, is the first step toward building a life that doesn't require constant self-betrayal, just to participate in basic social exchange. David's topic was success. He couldn't tolerate one more conversation about winning, achieving, climbing, acquiring, because he'd realized finally that he'd spent his entire adult life succeeding at becoming someone he wasn't. And every conversation about success reinforced the prison he was trying to escape. Your topic will be different, but the mechanism is the same. Somewhere in your life, you're maintaining a persona that's killing you, and small talk is how you keep it alive. Your intolerance is your soul's refusal to participate in its own murder anymore. Listen to it. There's a particular quality to the dreams that emerge during spiritual awakening. They don't feel like the normal dream debris, the random mental housekeeping where your brain processes the day's events through surreal collage. These dreams have weight. They have texture. They have an unmistakable sense of importance that lingers long after you've opened your eyes. You wake from them with your heart racing, your body covered in sweat, and an overwhelming certainty that you've just been shown something essential about your life. The images are huge: tidal waves swallowing cities, buildings collapsing in slow motion, being chased by shadowy figures through endless labyrinths, standing naked in public, drowning in familiar spaces, finding rooms in your childhood home you never knew existed, watching your teeth crumble and fall out, climbing stairs that never end or descending into darkness with no bottom. These aren't dreams, they're transmissions. They're your unconscious escalating its communication, because the subtle messages, the whispers, the hints, the gentle nudges have been systematically ignored. And the unconscious, when ignored for too long, doesn't just give up and go away. It amplifies, it intensifies. It starts speaking in symbols so violent, so visceral, so impossible to dismiss that you have no choice but to pay attention. Jung spent decades analyzing dreams, eventually developing one of the most sophisticated frameworks for understanding the psyche's symbolic language. And the central insight of his work was this: dreams are compensatory. They balance consciousness. When your waking life is too one-sided, too narrow, too committed to a particular perspective, the unconscious produces dreams that present the opposite view. Not to confuse you, not to torment you, but to restore psychological equilibrium. But when you're undergoing spiritual awakening, when your entire identity structure is breaking down, when your persona is collapsing, when the self is demanding conscious recognition, the compensatory function of dreams goes into overdrive. Because the imbalance isn't minor, it's catastrophic. You're living a life fundamentally at odds with your authentic nature. You're maintaining an identity that actively suppresses your developmental trajectory, and your unconscious knows this with absolute certainty, so it starts producing dreams that mirror the violence of that suppression. The woman who drowned every night. Let me introduce you to Sarah, 42 years old, married, 2 children, career in hospital administration. By every external measure, her life was successful, stable, enviable. But for 8 months, Sarah had the same dream, sometimes nightly, sometimes multiple times in a single night. She was drowning in her childhood home. The details varied slightly. Sometimes the water came from the basement, rising slowly until it filled every room. Sometimes it poured through the windows like waterfalls. Sometimes she was already underwater when the dream began, struggling toward a surface she could never reach. But the essential pattern was identical: her childhood home. Water, the sensation of suffocating while surrounded by familiar objects. And always the awareness that no one was coming to save her. Sarah tried everything to stop these dreams. She changed her sleep schedule. She stopped watching television before bed. She tried meditation, therapy, sleeping pills, dream catchers. Yes, actual dream catchers. Nothing worked. The dreams continued with relentless intensity, and what made them unbearable wasn't just the nightly terror. It was the feeling they left behind, a grief so profound it followed her into waking life, coloring every interaction, making her weep unexpectedly in grocery stores and parking lots. When she finally came to work with me, she said something that revealed everything. "I don't understand why I keep dreaming about my childhood home. I had a good childhood. My parents were loving. Nothing traumatic happened there. Why is my unconscious torturing me with these images?" And here's what I asked her. "Sarah, whose life are you living?" She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "What do you mean?" "I'm living my life." "Are you? Or are you living the life your mother couldn't live?" The silence that followed was absolute, and then quietly, almost inaudibly, "Oh my God." Decoding the dream, the mother's unlived life. Sarah's mother had wanted to be a marine biologist. She'd grown up near the ocean, spent her childhood fascinated by tidal pools, dreamed of studying deep-sea ecosystems. But she'd gotten pregnant at 21, married quickly, and spent the next 4 decades as a homemaker. She never complained, never expressed resentment, never said a single word about the life she'd sacrificed. But Sarah absorbed it all. The quiet disappointment, the resigned acceptance, the unspoken message that daughters exist to be practical, not passionate. So Sarah became exactly what her mother needed her to be: stable, responsible, risk-averse. She chose hospital administration because it was sensible. She married a man who was suitable. She built a life so structurally sound, so perfectly conventional, that no one could accuse her of wasting her potential. But here's what she never did. She never asked herself what she actually wanted. She never examined whether the potential she was fulfilling was hers or her mother's projected fantasy of redemption. And her unconscious knew this. It knew she'd spent 42 years drowning in her mother's unlived life. It knew she'd built her entire identity around being the person her mother wished she could have been. Sensible where her mother was disappointed, practical where her mother was once passionate, contained where her mother might have been wild. The childhood home in the dream wasn't just a setting. It was a symbol of psychological origin, the place where Sarah's identity had been formed, where she'd absorbed her mother's unspoken expectations, where she'd learned to sacrifice her authentic self for the comfort of familial approval. And the water, Jung's universal symbol for the unconscious, was drowning her. Because when you live someone else's life, when you suppress your genuine nature to fulfill another person's unlived potential, your unconscious quite literally suffocates. It has nowhere to go, no way to express itself. It becomes trapped in the basement of your psyche, rising slowly, filling every room until you can't breathe. The dream was brutal, but it was also merciful. It was showing Sarah exactly what was killing her before it was too late to change course. Big dreams versus ordinary dreams. Jung made a crucial distinction between what he called ordinary dreams and big dreams. Ordinary dreams are personal processing, your psyche sorting through daily experiences, consolidating memories, working through minor anxieties. They're important, but they're not transformative. They fade quickly. They don't demand interpretation. They're psychological housekeeping. Big dreams are different. They have an archetypal quality. They contain universal symbols: water, fire, snakes, houses, journeys, death, birth. They feel significant even if you don't understand why. They linger in your consciousness for days, weeks, sometimes years. They repeat with variation, like a theme developing in a symphony. And they often emerge at crucial transition points in life: adolescence, midlife, approaching death, or during periods of profound psychological upheaval, like spiritual awakening. These big dreams aren't coming from your personal unconscious, the repository of your individual experiences, memories, and repressed content. They're coming from what Jung called the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of psyche that contains the inherited patterns of human experience, the archetypal structures that organize consciousness across cultures and throughout history. And when you're undergoing spiritual awakening, big dreams come in clusters. Suddenly, you're not just having one significant dream a month. You're having 3 or 4 a week. Your dream life becomes more vivid than your waking life. You start keeping notebooks by your bed, filling pages with bizarre imagery that somehow feels more true than your everyday reality. And the symbols escalate in intensity because the unconscious is trying to break through decades of habitual consciousness, years of psychological defense, a lifetime of refusing to see what you don't want to see. The amplification method, connecting personal to universal Jung, developed a specific technique for working with these symbolic dreams, which he called amplification. Unlike Freud's method of reduction, where every dream symbol gets reduced to childhood trauma or sexual repression, amplification expands the symbol, connecting your personal experience to universal mythological patterns. Here's how it works. You take a dream symbol, say drowning, and you ask, where does this symbol appear in mythology, in fairy tales, in religious texts, in art? You discover that drowning appears everywhere. Jonah swallowed by the whale, baptism as death and rebirth, the flood myths in countless cultures, Ophelia in Hamlet, the Fisher King's wasteland, and suddenly your personal dream connects to something vastly larger. Your individual suffering links to humanity's collective experience of psychological death and transformation. For Sarah, we amplified the drowning symbol by exploring its mythological dimension. In nearly every culture, submersion in water represents descent into the unconscious, confrontation with the mother archetype, and the necessity of dying to an old identity before a new one can emerge. The hero must drown, must let go of who they were, to be reborn as who they need to become. But here's the crucial insight. In Sarah's dream, she never drowned completely. She never died. She just kept suffocating, kept struggling, kept almost drowning without the release of actual death. And that's the psychological torture of living an unlived life. You don't get the transformation that comes from genuine death and rebirth. You just get the slow suffocation of maintaining an identity that kills you by degrees. The unconscious was showing Sarah, you need to let this version of yourself drown completely. Stop fighting for air in this life that isn't yours. Let it end, so something new can begin. Archetypal invasion. When myths possess your dreams, as spiritual awakening intensifies, another phenomenon emerges. Archetypal invasion. This is when universal patterns from the collective unconscious stop being abstract concepts and start appearing in your dreams as living presences. You dream of encountering a wise old man who speaks in riddles, a dark, feminine figure who offers forbidden knowledge, a divine child who holds the key to renewal, a trickster who dismantles everything you think you understand. These aren't characters your personal psyche invented. They're archetypal figures, structural elements of human consciousness that have appeared in myths, legends, and religious visions throughout history. Jung identified dozens of them. The hero, the shadow, the anima, animus, the great mother, the wise old man, the trickster. And when they appear in your dreams, they're not symbolic. They're experiential. They have autonomy. They speak with authority. They demand something from you. This is terrifying if you don't understand what's happening. Suddenly your dreams feel like they're being invaded by forces beyond your control. You wake with the distinct impression that you've been in the presence of something numinous, something sacred and dangerous and utterly real. and your rational mind, your educated, modern, skeptical consciousness, has no framework for processing this experience. But Jung did. He understood that archetypal invasion is a sign that your ego is being confronted by the deeper structures of the psyche. Your small self is meeting the larger self. Your personal consciousness is being overwhelmed by transpersonal content. And this overwhelm, while frightening, is necessary because the ego cannot individuate on its own. It needs to be dismantled, humbled, instructed by forces greater than itself. It needs to recognize that it's not the center of the psyche, just the center of awareness. Sarah had one such dream 3 months into our work together. She was back in her childhood home, the water was gone, and she encountered an old woman in her mother's bedroom. But this woman wasn't her mother. She was ancient, draped in seaweed with barnacles growing on her skin. She smelled like salt and decay, and she spoke with absolute authority. You cannot inherit what was never lived. You must drown the borrowed life to breathe your own. Sarah woke from this dream transformed, not healed, not yet, but oriented. She finally understood what her psyche had been trying to communicate for 8 months. She was carrying her mother's unlived life like ballast, and it was drowning her, and the only way forward was to release it, to let it sink, to accept that her mother's disappointment was not her responsibility to redeem. The Dream Symbol Tracker, a practical method. If you're experiencing intense symbolic dreams, and if you're going through spiritual awakening, you almost certainly are. You need a systematic way to work with them, not to control them, not to stop them, but to decode their messages before the unconscious has to escalate further. Here's the method I teach, adapted from Jung's amplification technique. Step 1. Record immediately. Keep a notebook or voice recorder by your bed. The moment you wake from a significant dream, record it. Not later, not when you've had coffee, immediately. Dreams fade with shocking rapidity, and what seems unforgettable at 3 a.m. becomes a vague impression by breakfast. Write everything, even details that seem irrelevant, the color of a door, the texture of a surface, the emotional tone, everything. Step 2. Identify the central symbol. Most dreams have multiple images, but one will have the most emotional charge. For Sarah, it was drowning. For someone else, it might be the collapsing building, or the shadowy pursuer, or the unknown room. That symbol is your entry point. Step 3. Personal association. Before you reach for dream dictionaries or mythological references, ask yourself, what does this symbol mean to me personally? What memories, feelings, or experiences does it connect to in my own life? This is crucial because symbols are never purely universal. They're always inflected by your individual experience. Step 4. Amplification. Now expand the symbol by exploring its mythological dimension. Where does it appear in stories, myths, religious texts? What has this symbol meant to human consciousness across cultures? You don't need to be a scholar for this. A simple web search for mythology of drowning or water symbolism in myths will yield rich material. Step 5. The question. Finally, ask the dream a direct question. What are you trying to show me about my life? And then, this is crucial, write whatever comes. Don't edit, don't rationalize. Let your unconscious answer through automatic writing. The response will often shock you with its clarity. Sarah used this method for months, building a thick notebook of dream records and amplifications, and a pattern emerged that her conscious mind had never noticed. Every drowning dream occurred within 48 hours of Sarah making a decision that prioritized security over authenticity, choosing to stay in her job rather than explore other options, agreeing to take on family obligations that drained her, silencing her own needs to maintain peace. Her unconscious was showing her in real time The cumulative effect of these choices. Each one felt small. Each one seemed necessary, but together they were drowning her, and the dream was the only language powerful enough to break through her rational justifications. When to seek professional help versus when dreams are initiatory. I need to be extremely clear about something. Not all intense dreams are signs of spiritual awakening. Some are signs of psychological crisis that requires professional intervention, and distinguishing between initiatory dreams and pathological dreams is crucial. Here are the markers of when you need help. If your dreams involve detailed plans for harming yourself or others, you need immediate psychiatric evaluation, not Jungian analysis, not dream work, clinical intervention. If you're unable to distinguish dream content from waking reality, if you're having psychotic breaks where dream imagery bleeds into ordinary consciousness, you need medication and stabilization before you can do psychological work. If your dreams are trauma repetitions, literal replays of abuse, assault, or traumatic events, you need trauma therapy with someone trained in EMDR or somatic experiencing, not symbolic interpretation. If your sleep is so disrupted that you're experiencing severe insomnia, exhaustion, or daytime hallucinations, you need to address the physiological component before the psychological one. Jung himself was clear about this distinction. He worked with many patients who were experiencing psychological emergencies, and he knew when medical intervention was necessary before symbolic work could proceed. The unconscious can be remarkably wise, but it can also become destabilized to the point of producing dangerous content. The difference is this: initiatory dreams, no matter how intense, have a sense of purpose. They're showing you something, teaching you something, calling you towards something. They're compensatory, balancing an imbalance in your consciousness. And even when they're terrifying, they leave you with the feeling that you've encountered meaning, not just chaos. Pathological dreams, by contrast, feel fragmenting. They don't teach, they traumatize. They don't reveal, they obscure. They leave you more confused, more dissociated, more disconnected from reality rather than more connected to deeper truth. And they're often accompanied by other signs of psychological breakdown: loss of appetite, inability to function, suicidal ideation, paranoid thinking, complete social withdrawal. If you're unsure which category your dreams fall into, please seek professional assessment. Better to get help you don't need than to ignore warning signs that escalate into crisis. But if your dreams are initiatory, if they're violent but purposeful, terrifying but meaningful, then they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They're dismantling your old consciousness to make room for new consciousness. They're showing you what you've refused to see. They're speaking the truth your waking mind won't acknowledge. And the proper response isn't medication or suppression. It's engagement, it's dialogue, it's learning the language your psyche is speaking so fluently while you sleep. The night sea journey, symbolic death as preparation for rebirth. There's a mythological pattern that appears across cultures which Jung studied extensively: the night sea journey. The hero must descend into darkness, into the belly of the whale, into the underworld, into the forest where no light penetrates, and survive there long enough to be transformed. Jonah in the whale, Inanna descending to the underworld, Persephone taken into Hades. The hero's journey always includes this death-like passage through darkness. And when your dreams become violently symbolic, you're living this mythological pattern, not metaphorically. Actually, your psyche is taking you on a night sea journey. Every dream where you're drowning, suffocating, being chased, falling, or dying is your unconscious insisting that you must go through the darkness, not around it, that you must experience psychological death as preparation for psychological rebirth. Sarah's 8 months of drowning dreams were her night sea journey. and the journey had a specific purpose: to kill the version of herself that existed only to fulfill her mother's unlived potential. That identity had to drown completely. There was no gradual transition available, no gentle evolution, only death, symbolic psychological death, followed by the possibility of new life. When Sarah finally accepted this, when she stopped fighting the dreams and started listening to them, something shifted. The dreams didn't stop immediately, but they changed. In one dream, she stopped struggling against the water. She let herself sink. And at the bottom of her flooded childhood home, she found a door she'd never seen before. She opened it, and beyond it was ocean, vast, dark, infinite, and she realized, this isn't drowning, this is swimming. This is finally being in the element I was born for. 3 weeks later, Sarah quit her job in hospital administration. 6 months after that, she enrolled in a marine biology program, the same field her mother had abandoned 40 years earlier. But she wasn't living her mother's unlived life anymore. She was living her own, because she'd drowned the borrowed identity and discovered what was underneath. Dreams as maps to the unlived life. This is what I want you to understand about the violent symbolism in your dreams. They're not random terror. They're not your brain malfunctioning. They're precise maps to your unlived life. Every recurring nightmare, every symbolic death, every image of collapse or pursuit or loss, they're showing you exactly where your consciousness has become too narrow, too rigid, too committed to an identity that's strangling your authentic development. If you're dreaming of tidal waves, your unconscious is overwhelmed by emotional content you've been repressing. The wave is everything you haven't felt, haven't grieved, haven't processed, and it's getting bigger because you keep adding to it. If you're dreaming of buildings collapsing, your identity structure, the persona, the roles, the self-concept you've built, is fundamentally unstable. It's going to collapse whether you consciously participate in that collapse or not. The dream is giving you advance warning. If you're being chased by shadowy figures, your shadow, all the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or repressed, is pursuing you. And it will continue pursuing you until you turn around and face it. If you're standing naked in public, your persona has failed. The social mask has fallen off, and your unconscious is showing you that exposure is inevitable. The question is whether you'll accept your vulnerability with grace or continue trying to maintain the illusion of having it all together. If you're finding unknown rooms in familiar spaces, your psyche contains possibilities you haven't explored, capacities you haven't developed, entire dimensions of self you've never accessed. The dream is inviting you to explore. Every symbol is specific, every image is purposeful, and the violence of the symbolism is proportional to the violence you're doing to yourself by living inauthentically. Your dreams are mirrors. If the reflection is terrifying, it's because the reality they're reflecting is terrifying. You're suffocating your soul, and your soul is showing you exactly what that suffocation looks like. The integration, honoring the dream's wisdom. So what do you do with this understanding? How do you work with violently symbolic dreams in a way that serves your development rather than just feeding your anxiety? First, you honor them. You stop treating them as problems to be solved or symptoms to be eliminated. You recognize them as communications from the deepest part of yourself, the part that knows what you need better than your conscious ego ever could. Second, you engage them. You write them down. You sit with their symbols. You ask what they're trying to show you. You use the dream symbol tracker method to decode their messages systematically. Third, you act on their wisdom. This is crucial. Dreams don't want interpretation alone. They want embodiment. They want their insights to change your actual life. If your dreams are showing you that your marriage is dying, you need to address your marriage. If they're showing you that your career is killing your soul, You need to address your career. If they're showing you that you're living someone else's life, you need to reclaim your own. Sarah didn't just interpret her drowning dreams. She acted on them. She made massive, life-disrupting changes based on what her unconscious revealed. And that's when the dreams transformed. Not because she'd solved them, but because she'd honored their message by changing her life in accordance with their wisdom. Fourth, you develop a relationship with your dream maker. You start thinking of your unconscious not as a malfunctioning part of yourself, but as an autonomous intelligence that's trying to help you. You can even dialogue with it. Before sleep, you can say, out loud or in writing, "Show me what I need to see. I'm listening. I'm willing to look at what I've been avoiding." This isn't magical thinking. This is acknowledging that your psyche is vastly more complex than your ego, and that the unconscious responds to conscious attention. When you treat your dreams as important, they become more coherent. When you ignore them, they become more chaotic. It's a relationship, and like any relationship, it requires mutual respect and genuine communication. The question you must answer. Let me ask you directly, what are your dreams trying to tell you? Not what you think they mean, not what you hope they mean. What are they actually showing you about your life? What truth have you been avoiding that your unconscious is now screaming about while you sleep? Maybe you're drowning in someone else's expectations. Maybe you're being chased by the parts of yourself you've rejected. Maybe you're watching your carefully constructed identity collapse because it was never truly yours. Maybe you're dying in your dreams because some part of you needs to die so something new can be born. Whatever it is, your dreams know. They know with absolute certainty, and the violent symbolism is their way of breaking through your defenses, your rationalizations, your elaborate strategies for avoiding the truth. The dreams will continue until you listen. They'll escalate until you act. And if you continue ignoring them, they won't just stay in your sleep. They'll start manifesting in your waking life, as symptoms, as crises, as the actual collapse of the structures you've been watching collapse symbolically. But if you listen, if you really listen, if you honor what they're showing you, if you have the courage to let the false self drown so the true self can breathe, then the dreams transform. They stop being torture and become guidance. They stop being invasions and become invitations. They stop being nightmares and become initiations. Sarah's final dream in this series came almost a year after the drowning dreams began. She was swimming in dark water, deep water, open ocean. No land in sight, no destination, just swimming, and she felt, for the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she belonged. The water wasn't drowning her anymore. It was holding her. It was home. Your dreams are waiting to take you home too, to the self you've always been, but never had permission to become, to the life you've been afraid to claim, to the truth you've been avoiding for decades. The question is, are you ready to drown the borrowed life and discover what lies underneath?